Yes.
You know, it's something that might stick out with, say, the Zarathustra and stuff, or something like that, or it's a very typical element in the Middle East. And he raises a point that we don't really think about it that much, but throughout history, there have been these two classes in various societies. Now, when I look at the way people think, that when they tend to think in pure abstractions, tends to represent the priestly class. The priestly class are the moralizers, whereas the warrior class would say, yeah, morals, yeah.
Yeah.
For the priestly class, morals are real. Of course, for the warrior class, you get it whichever way you can get it done. And I just noticed that this clashes at the heart of Wolfram von Essenbach's Percival. And of course, Sir Percival, as he is the warrior class. And the hideously dark figure of the tale actually belongs to the priestly class, Klingsor. And yeah, it's interesting what leads to their downfall. What led to Klingsor's downfall was that he was so idealistic. So Percival wasn't. If you read between the lines of the Essenbach tale, so Percival is not a good guy. He starts out as a bad guy. He does a lot of bad things. And one day, after feeling all the bad that he's done, he laments of it, decides to change his ways. But Klingsor's purely idealistic. He wants to be good. He wants to join the forces of goods, but somehow, because he's so idealistic, he comes to a sense of disappointment and becomes the evil figure of the story. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I suspect once we finish chapter 4 and start into the medieval epoch, we're gonna come back to Percival and eventually Galahad over and over and over because of the central role that the Arthurian romance plays in the self-identity of the medieval worldview. And once we get into the medieval worldview, you definitely have a clear class split between the warrior class and the priestly class, like you're talking about, right? I mean, they divided the world into those who pray, those who fight, and those who labor. Um, in the ancient world, the religious practices are tribally owned, and the polis is a welding together of tribes around a shared pantheon. But that welding together still preserves the older tribal structure. Different families within a polis were responsible for different sects or cults. So, for example, Heraclitus's family in Ephesus, in Ephesus was responsible for the Eleusinian mysteries. He inherited both the kingship of Ephesus and the authority over the Eleusinian mysteries in Ephesus because they ran through his family. So that kind of it's sort of unusual. I mean, how to describe the relationship between those who fight and those who pray, in the ancient Greek world, it's not as straightforward a division as it is in the medieval world. So we'll do some comparing and contrasting as we go. Certainly Kenneth Smith's made the point many times that when we're trying to understand what the Greek myths mean, there is on the one hand the problem that it's hard to get past our own understanding of what a myth is, let alone what the Greek myths are, and also that our primary source the main source most people experience of of the myths is not, mythographers telling stories around, in a great hall or at the Olympics. It's these synthesizers, like Bullfinch or Hamilton, who have put together collections of myths. And in order to put those collections together, they've done more editing than we might suspect. They've had to suppress dozens of alternative versions of the myths to select the one that they picked. And a lot of the interest in the myths, when we dig deeper, comes from, well, who had those alternative versions? How many different versions were there of, say, the birth of Aphrodite, or how Athena came to rule over Athens, or sponsor Athens. And these distinctions get lost, and the meaning of them and the implications for how they actually practice their religion, it gets lost by the time we are absorbing the myths through Hamilton's collections or Bullfinch's or what have you. It's actually quite difficult to dig past all that and try to get closer to what the authentic experience of religion might have been like for the typical Athenian or Spartan or Corinthian. So Kenneth Smith makes the point that just like there's that struggle for us in trying to understand what those who pray might have been like, in the ancient world, even among the ancients, there was a diversity of perspectives. So, the naive peasant's view of who or what Zeus is, and what they owe to Zeus, would be very different from, a family that was running, say the Zeus cult at the Temple of Olympus, or different yet from what a philosopher might have. They're sort of all bringing sort of radically, there's an enormous diversity of perspectives about what the religion is, which is interesting because this sort of goes hand in hand with what we said before about the way that ancient polytheism was very permissive and interested in a diversity of gods, because they were trying to seek out what are all of the authorities over us in nature. Whereas by the time we get to the medieval world, they flipped that story on its head, and now they're trying to stamp out the diversity and argue that there's only one proper, correct answer, and that they know what it is. And if your answer differs, then you're wrong and you have to be stopped. So this thing in the ancient world, where even within a single polis there would be divergent opinions about who Artemis is and what she represents, and that wasn't a problem for them the way that the medievals saw it as a problem. This again sort of it's a challenge for us in understanding it, but it also means it gets harder to generalize about those who pray. In the medieval world, it's easier because they're struggling to create an orthodoxy. But in the ancient world, it's harder because they're absolutely not engaging in such a struggle, and they would consider it wrong. What they want to do is to know how things actually are, not to enforce their own opinions on everybody else.
One thing you notice with the Jewish world, the Hebrew world, is their priestly class or whatever seems to have been trying to develop a very pragmatic view of the world. They wanted to avoid all the nonsense stuff. There was obviously the Middle East was full of witches, but they didn't like that sort of stuff. Now, if you come to the Indo-European world, they're still highly imaginative. They're still soaking a lot of this stuff up. But the Western world inherits this very pragmatic view of the world that the Hebrew priestly class had. They seem to have been trying to some degree, avoid the extremes of mysticism. You look at the Gospels. You've got the free Gospels by the Jews, and they're very pragmatic, very matter of fact. Then you have the Indo-European, John. It just gets very imaginative and very crazy,
very mystical.
But this is what the Hebrew hierarchy was trying to avoid, and what we inherit.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, with that to kick us off, I'll go to hands before we go to the text. Farrell's got his hand up, and I'm glad he's joining us today. But according to my panel here, it says he's still connecting to audio. He may be having audio issues, so we'll come back to him once the audio issues are resolved. So, Phil, why don't you tell us what's on your mind?
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
because I'm connected if that's the case. Well, you know what Stephen said really reminded me when I was I guess about 3 years ago now, try to study some sort of Vedic thing. And I forgot the book, but it was part of the Mahabharata, you know. It's a very important part. And and, and I first want to admit that I'm very much a humanist. And we went through it, and this guy who was teaching it was an Indian guy, and he was leading, and we were going through all, some of the rituals, and we try to the hymns and a whole bit, like so we were very, open to that kind of thing. And then finally, it came to a day we were discussing what the battle that Arjuna was taking place. And of course, what happened was Arjuna was offended by the fact that, some of his relative and friends had, in a sense, taken advantage of him and stole his property and so forth. And a series of things happened, and finally it came down to the fact that, there's going to be a battle. And he's facing his army is facing the other army. And of course, he needs to go forward and fight the battle. And of course, he was sweating it out because he doesn't want to kill his friends and his relatives and so forth. And I could see him, my thought was at that moment, he was having a kind of interior fit of conscience and compassion for even those who offended him. So Krishna, who is the manifestation of Vishnu, one of the three main gods of Hindu religion, I think he was the eighth manifestation. I don't know the exact number. I think Rama was the seventh and he was the eighth. He had came to be a servant in a way to Arjuna, who's the main guy. And he was, the charioteer, I guess, for Arjuna. And he advised Arjuna, not, you got to go forward and do it. Of course, Arjuna says, I don't know. I have trouble with this. He says, you're a warrior, and a warrior has to do what a warrior does, which is to fight. Because you don't know the dimensions of heaven and morality. And at that point, I kind of jumped up and objected. The first time I really objected to him. He says, and I said, the gods don't know what the hell they're talking about. Because Krishna was a god. He was a manifestation of a god. He should go back to heaven and tell the council, the three, that, humanity has developed this sense of this moral dimension, and maybe we should pay attention to that. And that's what's my advice, They have come to a higher level. Maybe they have become priestly, as you might say, right? Rather than just the warrior necessary what to do. And I objected, and we got into kind of a big fight. I'm not myself, but most of the people, of course, Western in that sense. And we finally disbanded that. I actually accused the guy of saying, what you want to do is structure a relationship to a sense, justify the caste system. Of course, the teacher was very upset by my reminding of the caste system, like, don't go beyond your class, obey your orders, that's what you got to do, I could sort of see that as a military man too, obeying the thing. And so what happened was we kind of ended the session. And what happened, the teacher decided it wasn't worth it. He disbanded the whole meeting whatsoever because people were so upset that he disbanded. And I kind of think that maybe human beings should be allowed to become priestly as well as an industrial worker or whatever, there's some kind of fluidity, and just say, no, you are a warrior. That's what warriors do. Warriors fight. Stop trying to figure out why you're doing it. Just follow the orders. And so I just want to bring that up. I guess the clash of the Western culture uh, as it developed to the Eastern culture. Not that I admit, not that I say that I'm right. I'm just sort of saying I was a humanist, and that fight was between, I guess, man and God, if you want to put it that way. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. All right, let's go to the text. We're in section F of chapter 4. We're in paragraph 7. We have finished paragraph 6. It only took us several months. So for Farrell, who's just joining us for the first time, the upshot of section F is that to the modern, a myth is some kind of a story or a lie, right? It's something that's not true, but maybe a lot of people believe. But to the ancients, a myth was the opposite of that. That is to say, a myth isn't an inferior explanation or some kind of broken science. A myth is a successful rhetorical structure that allows us to draw people's attention to the invisible parts of the world that are important, like virtue or vice or tragedy. What are the things that give life and history meaning, and that make it difficult, that help us to identify where the challenges are? They're not, contrary to what Carl Sagan says in Cosmos, his original series Cosmos, a myth is not an attempt to explain where the rain comes from or why the sun rises. The modern interpretation focuses on those things so that it can point out errors and say, see, those people are primitives and we're advanced because we now know it's not Zeus that brings the thunder, it's this other thing. But to the ancients, that was the least important part of the myth. The important part of the myth was understanding that the position of a human being in the world is not the position of a god, that there are things in nature and even in our own natures that are outside of our control, and that we have to learn about if we're not going to get run over by them. We have to learn what the tragic tendencies are in human character and history, so that we can try to work around them and try to develop ourselves to do better than the people who came before. And they said this from the perspective of a culture that was looking back on a dark age that they had arisen out of, and that they recognized that that dark age isn't just something that happened, but it's something that their old ancient heroes did, that their old ancient heroes, in pursuing their desires and in exercising their virtues, inadvertently collapsed Bronze Age civilization, including their own, leading to a centuries-long dark age that, death, illiteracy, ignorance, violence, cruelty, all this stuff was the side effect of their great heroes of old trying to go do heroic things. So they tried to develop this new art form of mythos that was oriented towards explaining human nature and human events in such a way that it would be easy for people to remember how things had gone wrong before, and to try to focus people on thinking about how to avoid things going wrong again going forward. So this is a very different goal than what moderns consider to be a myth. But since this chapter is about the ancient perspective, we're not too concerned about what a modern thinks a myth is. We're concerned about what an ancient thinks a myth is. So having established kind of what the ancients, and I guess the upshot of that is that rather than a myth being a primitive stage of development in explaining the world, the ancients saw mythology, proper mythology, real mythology, not what a modern would call a myth. They saw proper mythology as the highest form of human thinking, because it's concerned with helping to raise the floor so that all people, from the wisest to the most foolish, do a better job than they would have otherwise of trying to tame the problems in their own nature, trying to negotiate better with other human beings, trying to make a better world than would otherwise happen. They were very concerned about these outcomes. And that's what mythology is for. And that they saw what they would call the mythic mind, a mind that thinks in terms of these metaphors, always trying to figure out how to link in a clear, juicy, unforgettable rhetorical device, how to link that to these difficult, abstruse, complex paradoxes that human beings are tied up in a way that could help people to be guided. They saw that mythic mind, the mind that's preoccupied with those things, as the highest and most adult form of the human mind. That's what we're supposed to grow into. That's what the path of maturation leads to. When it's successful, it leads to that kind of ability to be concerned with the future and with how you're going to train future generations and so forth. So where we begin with paragraph 7, we've sort of established this background. And now Kenneth says, like the slow wheeling of the constellations, Greek culture modulated from the archaic and poetic genius of myth into the rich panoply of philosophical concepts and systems. So he's describing the shift in ancient Greek culture from mythos culture to logos culture, where rather than merely experiencing and being immersed in a mythic culture, you get these people who are beginning to separate themselves from the mythic culture and comment on it and abstract away from it. They're trying to figure out what makes their belief system tick. That is, for them, it's not enough to believe and to live that life. They want to begin understanding why they live the way they do and what the implications are of their beliefs. And as they engage with their own mythos at this kind of new noetic intellectualizing level, they begin to develop what moderns think of as philosophy. Thales and Anaximenes, Anaximander, Parmenides, Heraclitus, all these pre-Socratic philosophers, everything that they say and do is within this context of looking back on their own culture and belief system and starting to create this body of commentary upon it and trying to extrapolate from it. Well, what does that mean? If Athena is like this, what are the general principles that we can say about the nature of wisdom? If Artemis is like this, what are the general principles that we can extrapolate about the nature of nature itself, of phusis, of becoming, of changing? So this abstracting is taking place, and that abstracting is a noetic activity. We've talked about gnosis versus noesis, where gnosis is the faculty that immerses people experientially in nature. It's what you're born with as an infant, although it matures as you grow up. And the noesis is this secondary faculty that all human beings have, but that has to be developed more after we're out of the womb, where we start to separate ourselves from our experience in order to make plans for the future, in order to try to predict the future, in order to try to control the future. Willfulness, schematic thinking, intellectualizing, planning, all of these things are part of noesis. So philosophy is what happens when noesis begins to develop a body of commentary on mythic gnosis. That's what he's talking about here. And he uses, notice again, the use of the term archaic when he says archaic and poetic genius. With the Greeks, of course, archaic doesn't just mean old. It means closer to the archai, to the core principles of nature or of the culture itself. What are the deep fountains of order, that are generating the culture or generating nature? Kenneth Smith, whenever he uses archaic in a Greek context, he's always doing wordplay. He knows that you're going to come at it thinking old, but he's also going to come at it trying to get you to think about. Let me put it this way. The difference between science and myth in this perspective is that science doesn't do anything to put you in touch with archai. It just shows you how to be effective. Here's what's true. Here's how you can manipulate. Here's how turbulence works. Here's how levers work. It's trying to teach you to have more power, to be more successful. It's pragmatic. But what it doesn't do is tell you whether or not it's a good idea to build an atom bomb for the Nazis, right? Myth is the level at which we try to plug back into the archai and say, okay, it's all well and good that you have this technology, but what should you be doing? where do people tend to get into trouble, and how do you align yourself to try to avoid some of that trouble? To be archaic in this ancient sense is to be more plugged into those deeper underlying principles. Or using the myth of Oedipus that we've been referring to frequently here, Oedipus is more noetic. He's less archaic. And if he'd been more archaic, he might have been able to head off the tragedy that happened to him. In some sense, the tragedy that happens to him in the first of the plays happens because he's not archaic enough. He's too meansy and not endsy enough. He's not focused on ends as much. What are the deeper principles? He's focused too much on how do I solve this immediate problem in front of me, not if I keep solving all these problems, what's going to end up happening to me? which is how we get to enjoy Oedipus Tyrannus as he backs his way into a tragedy. Phil, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Even before I started studying philosophy seriously, in a sense, I've always thought that my art was a triangular relationship between art, philosophy, and the human spirit. And that triangle is interesting because like philosophy is also a part of it. And the art, of course, is more, you might say, in quotes, primitive. And last week well, 2 weeks ago, I mentioned trying to figure out some deeper relationship with arche. What's interesting about arche is that it's sort of multidimensional, the way I look at it. It's not a singularity, it's a multidimensional thing. And it's even richer than the triangle I have. And the way I look at it, it really comes down to language in a funny way, or representation. And I got this in a way from Kant, so this helps me understand it, is that we can never really know what the universe is, what the thing is. We really are subjugated to exist in a world representation, which is therefore, in a sense, within us in some sense. But the representation has many ways of, you could say, framing the representation, or you could say a schema of how you look at things. And I like the ambiguity of the language versus an absolute language, because the absolute language says, no, you can only look at it this way. Things are made of atoms. And I could explain you according to the atoms how you are determined already from the beginning. And you could say, well, yeah, that might explain a lot of things, but like, how does that explain like something about love or kindness, or integrity, or just, I mean, how you gotta be able to frame these in different contexts. It has different meanings. And so therefore the ambiguity is not so much as like, oh, you're just fuzzy-minded. You're muddle-minded, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. What it does is open up. No, there's a different way of looking at this specific thing, depending on whether you're looking at politically, scientifically, psychologically, musically, or whatever. And all that does is that ambiguity allows, for one thing, the foreground, and the other things, the background a little, depending how much. But there's always a relationship between the foreground and the background. And you choose the foreground, the thing that applies specifically to this particular situation. Doesn't mean like, everything is foreground. I guess if you're a god, everything is foreground. There's nothing in the background. But as a human mind, because you're limited, you could only deal with a certain amount of stuff. And so you foreground things, but you don't forget about the background stuff. You allow it to come back into the foreground. Oh, yeah, now that you mention it, yeah, I have to think about it this way, and which is a different way of framing it, and giving it, I guess if you want to put Plato in a more correct place, a different way of giving it form, giving it structure, giving it meaning, rather than this is absolutely the way that God would do it. when you're not God. So I kind of think that ambiguity in a certain situation is correct. Let's open up the argument. Whereas, like in a specific situation, you say, no, that ambiguity is not working for me to try to solve this problem right now. And that's okay. All the science, mathematics, all that's okay. I mean, it's like, but keep it to a certain realm when it's applicable. But when other realms, you open up possibility that that's not the only way to think about it and look at things. And I think we have to be able to equivocate between a kind of absolute rendering and a kind of more vague, impressionistic rendering of things to say, oh no, there's other way of looking at things that's a little bit more confusing. Demands a lot more of the multifactor relationship to into. So that's what I got from the arcade, and I think that's a very important struggle that happened, particularly at the moment. With Plato and the pre-Socratics. But even Socrates didn't do that. I mean, Socrates says, I think there's more, but I don't know what it is. I'm confused, I'm the wise man because I don't know anything for sure, because I think he pinpointed the fact that, yeah, we're prisoners of our representation, and that's important to know, because you never really know. And next day the scientist is going to discover, oh, there is no Big Bang. In fact, some of them are claiming that. Like, we got this whole thing wrong. We are destined to go under the sea. We'll solve the whole thing with determinism if we just figure out the Big Bang. And so, the James Webb Telescope is apparently saying there's something before the Big Bang. Like, how that's possible? So I don't know. The James Webb Telescope could be wrong. So maybe there's still the Big Bang, but it certainly allows for a different way of framing things. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I mean, this is the central preoccupation of the ancients, is this problem that we're finite beings, we're mortal, we have a finite intelligence, we can only keep 7 plus or minus 2 things in our consciousness at a time, and yet somehow we're supposed to comprehend and act effectively within what amounts to an infinite cosmos. The number of problems and details around us is infinite compared to the amount of things we can think about at one time. And that mismatch, in the modern world, we try to pretend that's not a big deal. We say, oh, the human mind has infinite capacity, and we could be infinitely objective, we can know infinite numbers of things, and we'll just learn more and more, and it'll make us wiser and wiser. And the ancients look at that and they're like, that's a child's perspective. The adult's perspective is the problem doesn't go away. No matter how much you learn, at any given moment, you can still only hold 7 plus or minus 2 things in your consciousness at one time. And we're constantly dealing with problems that are bigger than that. And frequently they're not problems that are slightly bigger than that, but they're like multiple scales of magnitude bigger than that. And what is such a finite being supposed to do? How are we supposed to be effective when the mismatch is so big? So we've talked before about this idea that we have these 2 faculties in our brain, and that one of them, the more unconscious experiential faculty, is basically editing reality at all times automatically without us having to do anything, to push most of it into the background so that only a few things jump out to the foreground, the juicy things. In the current moment, what are the things that your unconscious thinks, oh, I better pay attention to that? Tiger, strawberry, cliff, it's like the things that matter right now, your unconscious selects those things and brings them to the conscious for you to think about. And where we get into trouble is that that's not a perfect faculty. We're often pushing into the background things that we really ought to be paying attention to. And it's especially hard when the thing that we should be paying attention to isn't visible. Like if it's a pattern or an underlying principle, like the tendency to tragedy when people get too egotistical and overconfident. That's not something you can see in front of you. As you look around the room and you say, well, there's a chair and there's a light, you don't see sitting on the table, oh, look, it's the tendency of human beings to become overly egotistical and create tragedies out of their lives. I should pay attention to that. Your unconscious is sort of thwarted by the fact that some of the most important things in life aren't visible. And so the purpose of the mythic mind and the mythic focus that the ancients were so concerned with was to use gripping stories to help pull these invisible things into a kind of visibility, to make them at least emotionally visible to us. Because after having watched Oedipus Tyrannus, we don't want that to happen to us. It's like, that was so horrible. We can't forget it. Now it's stuck in our brains, and now there's a chance that we might remember this thing about unintended consequences and what's the part of the picture that we don't know. We could be the best and the brightest and the wisest and the bravest and the most honest and every other thing and still end up with a tragedy, as an outcome, like Oedipus did. And so mythos is trying to teach us by making those things that would have been in the background unnoticed by us. It's trying to bring them into the foreground. As Cleon warns us, the unheeded thing escapes. He says it right in that play. And so the whole play is about taking something that we wouldn't have heeded, but that would have made our lives a disaster or a tragedy. That certainly made his life a tragedy, that made Oedipus's life a tragedy in that first play, and trying to make it memorable enough that maybe we can heed it. Maybe we have a chance now. Maybe it can compete against that shiny apple, or that rustling in the bush that might be a tiger. Maybe not screwing over our own lives through our ego has a chance of staying in our perception, thanks to mythos. So this is why they considered it the mature adult form, not a primitive, ignorant form. It's the mature adult form of the mind, because you're trying not to lose track of those things that matter, even when there's so many other interesting things going on around us to distract us.
Wasn't that the problem with Oedipus when the soothsayer keep telling you're blind to these things?
Yes.
And essentially, Oedipus says, "I'm the smartest guy in the room.
Yes.
Just shut up."
Yes. Because Tiresias has the advantage that because he's blind, all these visible things are not distracting him. He has an easier time paying attention to the invisible things because everything's invisible to him, right? He's able to sort among it. But Oedipus has the problem that the rest of us have, which is all this stuff is visible to us, except for the things that really matter, which are invisible. And so our foreground background faculty, which is working for us automatically, is thwarting us, and we don't even know that it's happening. But Tiresias knows. So anyway, Joseph and then Jennifer. Joseph, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
All right. So it's actually something that you said that was very interesting to me, is that when you were talking about the atom bomb and how, like, whether or not developing this is a good idea to begin with. And I often think about this, when even where I work or where other people work, is that they often look at how to do things more efficiently, but they don't know as to why they're doing it in the first place. And so the idea that's where I make this distinguishing between efficient and effective, like what is actually effective, like what is helping you achieve a goal. And so, and not asking that question, running in your head into a wall you could do that more efficiently. And the thing is that I really appreciate the fact that you talked about what mythos culture provides us is over time, a set of patterns. And those patterns actually articulate underlying principles. And those principles are things that actually serve as our guiding, to guide us to make good decisions, so to speak. So in a way, it's the inclusion of philosophy, not the exclusion of philosophy, or myth, that actually allows us to evolve. So that look back and say that that time period was primitive, and that it didn't necessarily, that those individuals didn't know X, Y, and Z, which is foolish because that's presentism. And that to not extract what valuable lessons we could get to that is to do it at your own peril. I mean, essentially. And, you could see that even in artificial entities, and I don't mean to make it so concrete or so crass, but even like a corporation that doesn't evolve, that doesn't heed the warnings of, they think that they've actually got the way and they've been successful and this is the way it is, and this is, not to necessarily think about why other corporations have failed in the past. And so anyway, my whole point being is that I really do appreciate more what you were saying when whether or not we're asking ourselves what we're doing in the first place is philosophical, and it's done through myths. And those myths convey concepts that that aren't in our consciousness yet. And whether it's a modern, not modern myth, but a myth that was written recently, or a myth that was written during the Greeks, it brings things into our consciousness that wasn't there. And that's also, there is I've been thinking about this relationship myth has with language as well, but and Phil talked about that. But I appreciated what you were saying, because a lot of times I just see people trying to make things more efficient at work, coming up with new processes, and they do make things more efficient. I shouldn't say that. They're brilliant. It's just pointless. I mean, it's great that they do it. It's wonderful, but it's like running in place. So you're actually not evolving by excluding it. So anyway, that's just my thought. I appreciate the example that you have provided.
Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, it's interesting stuff that Kenneth's talking about here, and he's really just trying to represent the ancient perspective to us without distorting it by turning it into a modernist caricature of the ancient perspective. He's really spent decades struggling with his own misunderstandings and misreadings of the ancient perspective and trying to strip them out and say, once you've done that, what are you left with? What do the ancients, how would the ancients look at their own stories? How would they look at us? How would they look at the world? And the conclusion that he reached is that it wasn't inferior. It's different. That we have this, I'm going to use the modern word, which is not the way the ancients would use it. We have this myth of the Great March of Progress, right? That anything older is worse and anything newer is better. Well, tell that to the Jews in 1935. I mean, the Holocaust was new, but it wasn't better. Things can be new and be, much worse or the same, or they could be better. It could be any of these possibilities. Things have to be evaluated in their own terms and not using some kind of quick mathematical shorthand like check the watch and whatever's newer is better. But it's built into the very name that we have for ourselves as moderns, that we assume we're better. Who wouldn't want to be modern, right? Who wants to be old-fashioned? The name itself predisposes the answer to the question when we start evaluating these other worldviews. But if we can strip all that out of it, then we start to say, well, we don't have any more registers for conscious thought today than Socrates had 2,500 years ago, right? It's still 7 plus or minus. If physical evolution isn't that fast, right? The conscious brain of Homo sapiens still can only handle a handful of things. So we aren't smarter in that sense of the word. And then that starts to raise questions about, well, then in what sense can we claim to be smarter? And the only possible sense could be, well, are we saying that we use our registers better than they use their registers? We're thinking about the right things and they were thinking about the wrong things. And if you watch Cosmos, I love Cosmos. I'm not dissing on Carl Sagan, but he definitely has a modern perspective, and it's all over it. Once you go through Kenneth Smith and rewatch Cosmos, you can see the modernism all over it. And key to it is every time he mentions mythology, He never talks about, is it teaching us to be wise and to rein in our egos? He always says, is it a good explanation of rain? Is it a good explanation of the stars? Is it a good explanation of physical phenomena? Is it an accurate explanation? And the assertion is that now we fill our registers with all these facts that we've collected that allow us to be more correct and accurate. But if that's true, that means we're emptying them of something else. And Carl doesn't want to talk about that. What is it that we're removing? And the way he depicts it, he was very influential on my thinking. He wrote a article for Skeptical Inquirer and years ago about the difference between the philosophy of science and the content, the discoveries of science. That was formative on my epistemology. But even then, you could see there was this sense of the only thing you could possibly be replacing when you put these more accurate facts in is less accurate facts, right? The whole domain of what about things that are important but not factual? Like, what should I do now? Should I or should I not go along with the pressure I'm receiving to conform, right? Well, that's not a question that can be answered with an equation or with a fact. And if I'm filling up my head with, if I'm filling up my 7 plus or minus 2 registers in my consciousness with how to, like you were saying, Joseph, how to be efficient at doing a thing, that means I'm displacing, things that might have occupied the registers that would be saying whether I should be doing the thing, right? I'm learning how to. It's like if the problem in your life is that you've dug yourself into a hole that you can't get out of. Becoming more efficient at digging the hole is not only doesn't help you get out of the hole, it makes it worse, right? It's like, was Hitler's problem that he didn't have enough power? If we just go in and teach him how to make better planes and bombs, does he become wiser and kinder? Is that how we solve the problem, by upping the power level and making him more efficient? No, there's a whole other dimension to life, which is this questioning what we ought to be doing, not, how to do it most effectively. I saw you came off mute, Joseph. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, just with the interesting thing is that what we can say about progress and facts is that, okay, you can present me with a set of facts right now, but it's at this period in time. It doesn't mean it's sustainable. Like, that's where the question is, right? The distinction where, okay, we're producing more. Well, are you going to get to a point where you can't produce, where you're going to be producing less or unable to produce? I mean, so I think of this in terms of like kind of, usually in the United States, a lot of people lived in a room, and there were 5 or 6 people in a room, and then everybody's moving into a house. They have 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, and now they have 4-bedroom houses with 2 cars. But what are you going to do? Get another? Now you have to up the ante again. I mean, it's not sustainable. Is my point? Is that you can't keep, that model
consumption
exactly based on just work. I mean, you're going to end up with everybody with a 10-bedroom house and 2 people. I mean, it's insane. So it's just a question of becomes a question of expectations of sustainability at that point. And I think that that's what facts. Oh, we're growing. Well, okay, but will you be growing in 10 years from now, or 15 or 20 or 30, or even making progress, so to speak?
Right.
As a thought.
Right. What's the teleology of the character of our behavior? What does it lead to? And of course, moderns hate teleology. We don't want to talk about it. We want to say teleology was a superstition and there's no such thing, and everything's just a mechanism and they just do what they do and there's no purpose or intent. That was the mid-20th century orthodoxy, right? At the peak of behaviorism, they argued not only don't animals have intelligence, neither do people, and we're just machines and we should all be programmed. Now we've retreated from that. In late stage, as the inadequacies of that worldview were really deviling us in the 20th century. So we're retreating back towards recognizing that maybe there is more to us than just programmable behavior, and maybe there are these bigger questions. But that's what's kind of leading to this new era of looking for answers in different places. Jennifer, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, thank you for this very wide-ranging discussion. I come to this as a person who is interested in what it means to be human, right? I'd love to rewatch the recording of this, because since I raised my hand, there are a full page of notes I've taken on all of the points that you guys have sort of raised. And one of the things that I feel, I want to go back to what Phil said about living in this ambiguous state, like what is a fact, what is not a fact, what should we be concentrating on, what shouldn't we be concentrating on? And for me, that feels like the root of philosophy. How do we become human? And Joseph's conversation of like, you know how to do things more efficiently, but are you using philosophical principles to say, are these things we should be doing? And Rick, your comment of like, oh, well, the problem with Hitler is that he didn't have enough power. So if we just throw some more power on there, like it's all going to work out great. And it's like, well, no, applying more effort to the wrong outcome, right? To the wrong path is not efficient. It is not helpful. And I wanted to circle back again to something that Joseph said that is near and dear my heart, not as a philosopher, but as a storyteller and as a human. When we have more consumption, when we lived in, 3 family members per room, per bed, right? It was very close. It was very hands-on. It was very connected. I think the opportunity for loneliness and isolation and misunderstanding may be different if I am living in my 10-bedroom house with my one or not one spouse. I've built in physical isolation, which may not be overcome by social interaction. And so when we think, is a modernist always means things are better? For me, the idea of postmodernism, which is not, I'm sure, like the real definition, because I don't believe in real definitions. I kind of have my alternate universe Jennifer definition of it. Postmodernism is the ability to look backwards and say, what worked better in 1950 or 1850 or 1500 than the way I'm currently approaching my lifestyle now? And when we talk about myth, and I think, Rick, you said like proper myth, not the way that we use it now. When we think about the proper Greek understanding of myth, it's shorthand to help you understand behaviors. It's your to-don't list, right? It's not the to-do list of things I need to do. I need to remember, oh, right, don't try to buck your fate. You're still going to kill your father and sleep with your mother. Like, that's a thing we don't want to do. So let's pay attention. And it's been so interesting for me to be in and out of various Zoom rooms with people from different cultural, educational, age perspectives, that we can say the myth of Oedipus, and it is a shorthand. It takes us somewhere together. You don't have to explain it at times, right? We know where you're going. We know the point. We know what you want us to feel, right? Not just learn a fact. You understand what we want you to feel. And for me, when you were talking about Carl Sagan, I don't have a lot of experience with him, but for me, the Greek myths were not physical explanations. They were not entitled to be a guidebook of Science 101. I'm not telling you why it rains. I'm telling you it's the tears from the gods, or whatever they came up with, right? And so it's just an interesting bit. And I'll wrap up here because I want to go back to where I started. The first thing that I wanted to respond to is something that Phil said about being in an ambiguous place. Where is your focus? Should I be focusing on this, like this little detail, or should I be zoomed out? And I keep coming back in my own life and my own work of like, are you under the microscope? Are you looking in the kaleidoscope? Are you looking in a telescope? Do you have a monocle on? Like, what is your perspective? And as you run into these barriers in your understanding, for me personally, it's useful to be like, oh, wait, maybe like I need to like zoom out a little bit. And if I can zoom out a little bit, maybe that'll be clear, but maybe I also need to zoom in a little bit more. So I think we were talking about like, what will AI do to humanity? Like, what can we just program more facts? I'm like, you're not going to make me more human, no matter how many facts you plug into AI. I can talk faster, I can look better, you can enhance me, you can do whatever. But my basic humanity, which we review in all of these ancient literatures up until something Geneva might have wrote yesterday, is exploring, why are we human? What does that mean? How do we connect? And Greg, you said, oh, you have 7 things that you can hold in your mind. Yes, we do. And that capacity does not seem to be, evolutionarily speaking, increasing anytime soon. So I think we should like put the brakes on going forward and review what did work for us, which was understanding, community, connection, self-understanding, discovery, beauty, language, poetry, all of that stuff. Like, let's do that instead of making 6 more Teslas, right? Like let's just concentrate on maybe getting some connection. So I'm just going to leave it there. But thank you for this really provocative question. Oh, and I said leave that there. I also would like to, at some point, talk about language choice. Are we, as a society, willfully misunderstanding each other because we refuse to settle on universal ideas of what language means? Or allowing ourselves the flexibility to play with the concepts behind the language, even if it is not as precise as an engineer might want? Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'm glad you're enjoying this. This, you know, one of the questions we ask ourselves sometimes is how can we be 77 weeks, 3 hours a week into this book and only be in chapter 4? And the answer goes to what you said initially, which is that, the way we structure these is pretty freewheeling. We want people to be able to, think about their own interests and their own lives and bring those things together with whatever the topic is. And that means we have to give people some time to talk and to explore ideas. And for us, it also means, we're not going to resolve everything in one session. There are certain themes are just going to come back. We can trust that this text is rich and provocative enough. It's going to remind us again and again of things. If I don't get what I want to say out this week, it's going to come up again next week or the week after. There's a churn going on here. But yes, this question of what does it mean to be human, and what are our options, for how to live life. These are the things Aristotle's always talking about, and that when we read it from a modern perspective, we usually skim past impatiently on our way to trying to find what we think his point is. And when he says, man is by nature a political animal, we skip the by nature part. We think, well, that must just be some like or something like that. We think he's just taken up space, and then we want to get down to debating, is man political or not, inadvertently proving his point by that. But of course, for him, the point is not that we're a political animal. It's that it's our character. It's the character of Homo sapiens. By nature, kata phusei, to the ancients, is this incredibly loaded term. It means deep, profound things. Kata phusei means it's beyond argument. I don't care what your ideology says. I don't care what your logic says. I don't care what your theology says. This is the nature of the thing. And to the ancients, nature trumps everything, right? We can, the ability that moderns have to deny reality because our ideology tells us, we'll forget about the details of what's actually happening. Our ideology provides the answer, and therefore we'll seek our answers there. Wouldn't have worked for the ancients at all. Because for the ancients, ideology can't ever trump nature. Nature is the ultimate authority, higher than the gods even. The gods were just expressions of nature. They didn't create nature. Nature created them. So it's an entirely different worldview, a whole different value system. And as a result, the meanings of words are just radically different than they are to us as moderns. And this is where the challenge comes in trying to read these texts, is we read into them the modern view and interpret the ancients as primitive versions of moderns. And in so doing, we're erasing who they really were. When Aristotle is trying to cut through his mentor Plato's fascinating rhetorical arguments, he's trying to cut through them and say, yeah, but what is the nature of the thing itself? Regardless of my arguments, what was it before I ever came onto the stage and began pontificating, to use Stephen's terminology from the chat? Before I tried to impose my opinion, what was there already? And then Aristotle wants to turn that on us and say, just like there's a nature outside of us that has its own character, each of us internally has our own character that is generating our personality and our behavior and generating our interests and what we pay attention to or don't. And therefore, if we want to know ourselves, Gnothi se auton, like the Oracle at Delphi says, that means we have to explore that character that's hidden inside of us and try to figure it out, because that's where everything is coming from, not from our decisions about ourselves or our ideologies, but from this kind of fountain of order that's invisible to us. It's fascinating stuff. It's a complete, what he's doing in chapter 4 is basically laying out step by step, lettered section by lettered section. He's challenging core modern ideas that cause us to misread the ancients and not see them for who they are, to try to help us to do what he did, which is to get to where you can read an ancient and hear their own authentic voice speaking and hear how different their perspective is from our different, rather than trying to hear them as, a link in a chain that leads to our glorious selves, the crowning creation of all of nature. Yay us, we win. If you're interested in this stuff, this is today's session is pretty much what they're like. They have been, at least for the last 76, and I think will be until I keel over someday. James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, it's interesting discussion. Thanks. For me, it raises the question, kind of a conflict between mythos and philosophy. Is Kenneth Smith saying that that we've become abstract in our philosophy, or taking up a certain kind of way of philosophizing where the emphasis is on reasoning, perhaps, maybe Socrates has something to do with that, and that we're he started this trend of analyzing everything, examining. It's just something like unexamined life is not worth living. So you have to, instead of living, you have to examine your life.
Yes.
And that could be a way of getting carried away with too much examination, which leads to maybe perhaps something like analysis leads to paralysis, or and so it creates a conflict that between philosophy and mythos, or living, how to live. And
Yes.
maybe it's not. Maybe the point is that we should be concerned more with the practice of living, rather than analyzing or thinking, reasoning. Is that sort of the point he's making? That our modern way of philosophizing, a kind of overemphasis on self-analysis and reasoning.
Yeah. Well, you certainly asked the critical question, didn't you, James? Because that's definitely, Kenneth Smith has a lot of opinions about this, and he's not alone. He's drawing off of Nietzsche, and Nietzsche had some withering things to say about German philosophers. He's drawing off of Kierkegaard. He's drawing off of Hegel. He's this whole rich existentialist tradition that starting with Hegel was trying to re-excavate the ancient Greek perspective. I cite it almost every week. Hegel said there wasn't a single fragment of Heraclitus that Hegel didn't incorporate into the foundations of his own Hegelian philosophy. He saw his job as rediscovering this lost organic perspective on existence and knowledge. This ancient metaphor of a universe not made up of parts and machines and things, but made up of organisms, overlapping organisms, all of which want to grow and develop according to their own internal nature, each of which is not only what it is, but it is also the seeds of its future self. This perspective of a unfolding order in the cosmos is what Hegel was trying to capture with his dialectic. And once you filter that through Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Hannah Arendt and Kenneth Smith, you get this critique of these static philosophical systems that are attempting to describe everything as a steady state. This is just the way it is. Things are this way, and they're not the way that they're not. And that obsession with the law of the excluded middle and with trying to simplify things to black and white is very typical of noesis. Hegel warns us about the dangers of Verstand, because it likes to have its answers crisp and precise. And to do that, it's going to recategorize everything in the world to fit into black and white categories so that it can declare them true or false. And this follows from that, and that does not follow from the other thing. It wants hard answers. And to get those hard answers, well, since we don't actually have the godlike ability to transform the world to satisfy our logic, what we do instead is we lean into that capacity we have, nescience, for making things disappear. So we push into the background everything that doesn't satisfy our ideology, and it sort of disappears out of our perspective of the world. And all that's left behind are the facts, which Nietzsche criticized. There's precisely no such thing as a fact. He says the facts that seem to prove that our ideology is right. Those are the only parts of the world that we can see when we're committed to an ideology. And ideological thinking is a natural outgrowth of noesis. You know, it's very hard to be a mathematician without being ideological. I'm not saying there aren't people who avoid it, but you know, they avoid it because they know what the gravity pull is of their discipline, and they consciously work against it. If they don't consciously work against it, they'll slip into it. Noesis is a gravity well, just like gnosis is. So his argument in this, he's really just recapitulating and re-expressing this existentialist tradition, is that modernity is of the three epochs we know about, the ancient, the medieval, and the modern, of the three that we have documented so far, modernity is the most noetic. It's hyper noetic. It's hyper intellectual. It's hyper rational. It wants to systematize everything, right? You can see it in the law code. You can see it in the contracts of the economy. You can see it in elections. Everything we do is structured into systems and processes and steps. And the end game of that is that nobody has any free will at all, because the law will tell you exactly what to do at every moment. And as long as you do exactly what you're programmed to do by the law, then you are not a criminal. And if you deviate, then you must be punished. And that's the purpose of justice. The purpose of justice is to get everybody walking like little cogs in a machine in complete compliance with the system of instructions that's so complex that not only doesn't any layman understand it, neither does any lawyer. They all have to specialize in some tiny piece of the law. And even in their specialty, they don't always get it right because it's too damn complicated. But that's the end game. This is modernity in a nutshell. All resources must be utilized. Everything must be harnessed into one great big machine. And where in that is there room for asking questions about whether this is a good idea? You know, so the result is, within this context, James, you know, answering your question, and it's the right question. It's a great question. You know, the inevitable result is that we redefine all of the important terms to make them compatible with the big machine. Because anything that doesn't do what the big machine wants is grit in the Vaseline. You know, it's a sabot in the gears. It messes with the machine, and the machine doesn't want to be messed with. So truth is redefined, free will is redefined, justice is redefined, and certainly philosophy is redefined until 20th century philosophy becomes the noetic equivalent of angels dancing on the head of a pin. You know, you can philosophize as long as it's irrelevant. Philosophy departments are full of people whose version of philosophy is that they write what philosophers of the past used to think, and they argue over whether they used a certain word the same way. Do these two philosophers agree about this word or not? And then that's your thesis, and that's your career. You write book after book about, you know, comparing and contrasting this one French existentialist to this other French existentialist, and that's a philosopher in the modern world, which means an academic, which means somebody who's able to pay his bills because he doesn't ask questions like, I wonder if my whole university system is corrupt. I wonder if there are just deep moral problems with the way that we build our legal code. I wonder if all those things that, you know, Thales would do, or Heraclitus would do, or Aristotle would do, that's all forbidden in the modern world. You can't get into that stuff. You'll be called an extremist. So Kenneth Smith would agree with you, James. This is the problem.
Yeah. So you think that that's the reason why someone like Trump is so attractive? I mean, so popular to people who are, you know, I mean, they're raging against the machine.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, you know, everybody has a sense that something is wrong. You know, everybody has a different explanation for exactly what it is or what we're supposed to do about it, but hardly anyone looks around the modern world and goes, this is perfect. This is just the way I like it. And almost everybody feels uncomfortable. And, you know, whether you like complicated systematized answers or whether you like simple, brick through the window answers depends on your character. And your character, is heavily informed by the ideologies that you subscribe to. So, but I wouldn't just pick out Trump. I mean, I think every political group in the modern world, tends to, and it's not, doesn't matter what I think. I mean, Kenneth Smith, I think, would say all the political groups in the modern world tend to hyper noeticize. They hyper intellectualize. They hyper abstract things. They hyper polarize. Everything is, the law of the excluded middle, simple either ors. You're with me or you're against me. You see, and I think maybe the most ironic expression of it is even the people who see that itself is a problem, the overpolarization, and say we should not polarize, express their opposition to polarization in the same you're either with me or you're against me. You shouldn't polarize. People who polarize are wrong. People who never polarize like me are right. It's like it turns into the same, you scratch the surface of tolerance and diverse support for diversity in the modern era. And once again, you find intolerance in the way that we structure it, because we're not sure how else to think or express ourselves. Everything is got this tendency in us towards rigidity and steps and algorithms. In Lord of the Rings, there is a passage, and I think it's in a conversation either involving the Ents or involving Gandalf, when they're talking about Saruman, when they says he has a mind of gears and machines. When he thinks, he visualizes great machines and gears turning, and he can't see anything else. He can't see living things. That's why the Ents are able to take him over and tear down his walls and trap him, because he has no concept of what role there is in life for life. He only sees what role there is in life for order and entropy as the dominant principles. And that, when Tolkien wrote that, he wasn't just describing a fictional character. That was Tolkien's criticism of the modern world, right? He was in love with his childhood trees and farms, and he was concerned about the spread of warfare and industrialization, which he saw as a metaphor for pretty much how we organize everything. Phil, and then Stephen. Come off mute, Phil, and tell us what's on your mind. Oop, unless you stepped away. You still there? I think he stepped away. Go ahead, Stephen. Come off mute.
Yeah, I was just going to say, on the subject of Oedipus, I was seeing some stuff on the net lately, and of course it pointed to Oedipus's answer to the Sphinx. And I'm not the smartest person in the world, of course, and I didn't really think about it, but it points out that Oedipus's riddle was talking about 3 stages of life. We start off as a child, we're crawling on all fours in the bright noontide of day, we're standing on 2 legs, and in the evening, age grabs us and we're on a crutch. And this was the story of Oedipus himself. He starts off as a child, he has his grand moment, which he screws up, and he ends up the broken down old man. He ends up like Tiresias, actually. He ends up physically blind because his eyes failed him. But no, Oedipus, you didn't use your eyes. You suffered from the American disease. The Americans who have all this fantastic stuff, but their ability to use the stuff has atrophied. Like Death in Monty Python, Death says to the American, you're always saying, I just want to say, let me tell you this. The American famously, according to Death, doesn't observe, doesn't listen. And of course, if we look at the stages of Oedipus's life, it gets very Freudian in that he has a disrupted childhood. He gets pierced through the feet, thrown out on the plain. And of course, we look at Greek culture for the nobles in particular. It's quite obvious they spent a lot of time trying to train their youth. We don't. or actually we're training the youth to be idiots. We actually have a program of idiocy in place to make sure they're idiots. I don't know, maybe it's consumer culture. We will turn them into good consumer, unquestioning consumers. Don't know what the trip is in the modern world. But the Greeks obviously felt, well, if we're going to survive, we have to train our young people to take the reins of adulthood. But in Oedipus's case, he gets disrupted, and it seems to be that this disruption is what causes his metaphysical blindness in his bright noon moments of day. And this reflects in the broken man at the end. And of course, this sounds, I always thought it sounds a bit like the description. You have the description of the schizoid character in Reich's work, where he says they suffer from an eye block. They haven't been brought out into life by their parents properly. Either they've been ignored or see something shocking in their childhood. And they close their metaphysical eyes against the world. This description of the schizoid character, and it sort of reminds me of Oedipus a bit. He goes out into the world with, he's not observing. He's just thinking, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I feel like doing. He's not actually, well, does this work? Part of the problem, what you were referring to, is the monism of one's own opinion. Now, the monist notices there is a difference. Somebody else thinks differently, and this is wrong. Somebody else thinks differently than me. This is wrong. They don't adopt a position. Well, this is a differing opinion. No. The monist will say, I am right. My vision of the universe is the correct one. And the aim is to assimilate or destroy anything which is different than myself. Now, of course, a dualistic perspective would say, just hang on a minute. How do you know that you're the way things should be? This is something that comes out in Albert Ellis's interpretation of Hume's point. The difference between the is and the ought. And you just see this all the time. Everyone's going, as Ellis would say, should, this ought to be, and they're not exploring the is. What is actually happening? You know, like if you form an opinion about the universe, when were you voted in as God? This is my problem. I of course, have been very opinionated in my life. And I started to stumble over, well, there's a problem there. Who the hell am I to judge the universe? And so Albert Ellis will say, well, if things work out the way you like or you think they should, that's nice. Very nice. But it ain't necessarily so. So Albert Ellis is taking Hume's point, and he says, don't disregard your ought, your should, contemplate it. That's a very nice piece of myth or fiction. Don't ignore it. But on the other hand, you have to be mindful of the realities. Somewhere something's gone wrong. In the childhood, the child starts out as me want, me get. It's a very monist point of view. And today, people were pointing out a few decades ago, this has become a raging illness in modern society. Me want, me get. A very monist point of view. No, those two different things. Me wants and what the reality is can be two different things. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, for those for those who haven't always been on these sessions, David and Donald and I are the ones who kind of know Kenneth and have spent time with him. And I might be the most verbal one on these calls, but that's only because I'm, translating. I'm helping to unpack because Kenneth writes densely. Periodically, Donald jumps in and adds something, far beyond my experience from times when he was in class with Kenneth and says, well, here's what he said about this, or here's another thing about Plato. And David, of course, just sits quietly in the background and hardly ever says anything. But without him, none of these would be happening because he creates the whole framework and put the stuff online and so forth. So, part of what's important from time to time, and I'm going to do it right now, is to completely deflate any sense that I'm an expert here. Just because I've spent decades reading Kenneth Smith and the stuff associated with it doesn't mean I have a complete education, that I fully get this. And I'm gonna reveal a bit right now, which is when Stephen said that the myth of the riddle of the Sphinx was about Oedipus's own life. I don't know how many decades I've been reading that play and how many years now I've been explaining it to people. That never once occurred to me. And now that you say it, it's absolutely obvious. That's the whole purpose of the riddle of that specific riddle of the Sphinx. The role that it plays in Oedipus Tyrannus is specifically to foreshadow, like you said, how that play is going to come out. And I didn't realize it until just this moment when you said it. And I broke into a big grin when you said it because I saw my own ignorance right there. It's just a big hole. And I never realized there was a hole until you showed how the riddle fits right into it and structures the whole story in a much more profound way than I'd ever read it. So thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, well, not my idea. I saw it on the net. So don't feel too embarrassed. I never worked it out. Oh,
yeah, but you brought it to me, right?
I had two eyes. I just didn't use them.
That's right. That's my problem, right? If you read or books about or watch videos written by pros about how storytelling works and how to structure a story, they'll tell you about the relationship between the protagonist and the supporting characters. And that's that you don't just season the story with a bunch of interesting random people. The specific supporting characters have to serve the specific story of the protagonist. Like they pull on the protagonist and they show contrasts with the protagonist to help understand who he is and why he does the things he does, and how the story could have gone differently, but it couldn't because of his own character. It had to go this way. And the role of Tiresias being blind from the beginning of the story, echoing Oedipus having to be blind by the end, that's all obviously set up there. That's critical. But likewise, the whole arc of the child, who can't quite walk right, turning into the adult standing on 2 feet, turning into the crippled, broken man. That really is his arc in the first play. You're right. You've got it.
Well, there is something I can offer there, and this is a point that we lose ability when we set up a situation. We've been the warrior, we've gone out, we've built the structure. The man standing on 2 feet builds the structure. But there's a problem with that structure, and it's very much modern civilization as well. We start to lean on it. Mm-hmm. We start to use it as a crutch. We start to use it as a prop.
Right.
And we're losing the skill that build it. This is a problem. When we create the seat and sit down, we're losing ability. It's like you must reflect that, gee, when I was back in school, I was doing all this heavy stuff when I was a teenager. And look at me now, my God, if I was put back in the class, I'd be struggling. I'm relying on what I've learnt. I'm leaning on it. I'm using it as a crutch, but my muscles are actually growing weak because of it.
Right.
So this is it. Oedipus conquers his kingdom, but he becomes complacent. He starts just leaning on the structures.
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of his downfall.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, he sends out the guards, he sends out the messengers, he uses the apparatus of state in the pursuit of solving the problem of the miasma of Thebes, when all along the problem was being carried inside of him and had been since before the story began. You know, this is that thing that the Greeks are so smart about that we're so dumb about. This idea that we are never just who we are right now, but we are also the unfolding of who we used to be, and that those relationships aren't arbitrary, that there is necessity, ananke, is at work in having made us who we are from who we were, and that in that course of developments, there is also the seed of who we're going to become. So, you know, in the riddle of the Sphinx, we see the infant who can't walk effectively. And then we see the man who seems to be competent to walk. But then we see the broken man who needs a cane to walk, who again can't walk. And the shallow Oedipal reading, to use the ancient perspective, is to just take those as three things that happen to be there. But the more profound ancient Greek reading would be that the reason he ends up broken is because of what he's carrying with him when he seems to be at his pinnacle. You know, that seed is already in him. That brokenness is invisible. It's not absent, it's present, but invisible. And it's going to become visible by the end. Not that it's going to be broken for the first time. The break is already in him from the ancient perspective, and it's already teleologically developing and unfolding. And so this is why with the mythos culture and the mythic mind, there is this focus on learning to pay more attention to the hidden harmony underneath current events, to say what is brewing and growing in us that's going to emerge, and what can we do about it now before it reaches full steam, rather than wait until after it's happened and it's too late to change it. You know, it's Oedipus's reaction in the awful moment of tragedy when the scales fall from his eyes and he realizes that his story has never been about what he thought it was about. It was about this other thing, and it was about that the whole time, and he just couldn't see it. You know, he was living out this tragedy without being aware of it. And his reaction right then is the shock and frankly the awe at the working of the fates, that it could have come out this way, but also his will's complete rejection of his actual story, to the point that he says, now that I see this, I wish that I had never seen it, and I wish that so strongly I'm going to remove the ability to see from myself, because what good has that done me? All this, I might as well not have had my eyes if they were only going to show me this, you know, and not have shown me the earlier things that I could have stepped to the side and avoided this whole outcome. They only showed me the things that led me on this path. What the hell good are they? I'm better, you know, he decides to emulate Tiresias. I'm better off without them. There is, I mean, one of the biggest differences between the modern perspective, you know, going back 500 years, modern, and the ancient perspective, is that the ancients had a keen taste for tragedy, which they believed was the key in which human life is composed. And they say it's not that they're pessimistic and they're downers and they're just trying to be, you know, make people sad. It's that there is an inherent difficulty in being a finite creature with infinite responsibilities, right? Because we're responsible for the consequences of our actions, and the consequences play out across an infinite playing field of the cosmos. And so we can't possibly comprehend everything that we're setting in motion. And that means there's always going to be an element of tragedy to everything that we do. And if we're prepared for that, and we don't deny it, and we watch for it, we can have better outcomes. Not necessarily avoiding tragedy entirely, but we can have better outcomes than if we're just in denial the whole time and saying, I don't have tragedy. I'm just a hero going from one glorious victory to the next. And next thing you know, you're Oedipus tearing your eyes out, right? So this is one of the things we can learn from the ancients. Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
The public loves me. I'm Oedipus. The public loves me.
And they did, right? They loved him. He was the best and the brightest, right up until they were like,
oh no, I'd imagine there's a lot of people in Thebes that were having a bad moment about Oedipus, but you'll say, no, the public loves me.
They love me. I'm the best. Yay me. Go team. What's on your mind, Phil?
Yeah, I originally had wanted to tell a different story, but now that Stephen has intervened, I think I will tell it differently. You know, like one of the things about modernity is we're all trapped within modernity to a certain degree. And one of the very, very clever icons of modernity, at least early modernity, is GE's how we say it, not logo, but his sort of like verbal logo.
We bring good things to life.
No, I think maybe I got the wrong company. Progress is our most important product. Right? In other words, it's not anything, it's progress itself. Modernity is the most important product. So he really capitalized that. And I think the I love Hegel, but I have a problem with Hegel because Hegel, in some sense, sort of like preceded that in a way and constructed the fact that he, in a sense, not that he invented, because he's always like looking at the past and in a sense, predicting, in a sense, the destiny of what's going on. So he didn't really do it. But he really put the whole thing about civilization is in a progress to a destiny. So he has, in a sense, quantified time. So whereas time, I think, in the old days was more of a relationship between where I'm at now and what I'm going to do. You know, like I got to go to dinner at whose house. That's the time that it takes. But we have created in modernity a efficient time of a grid system in which there's a watch, it comes down to seconds. And now if you're in a sports thing, it comes out to 100th of a second. So that's what it is. So we are progressing and pushing on this time, and he accepts that in a sense. And that this progress is going to move us ultimately to a destiny of its own. And not that he's doing it, but in a sense, the whole structure is moving in this way. That's the modernity itself. And I think of it as a little bit more circuitous than that, but nonetheless, I think that's one of the problems I have with him, and that there is a kind of a, how should I say, a quantifying this sort of like structural relationship of civilization itself. And what that does, in a sense, it places it, like a thumb that's pushing down on us in every moment of life, like, so if you wonder, like, who's bearing down? It's civilization itself. So that you can see Freud, civilization and discontent right there. I mean, everything is, and like, you're unconscious of that and it's bearing down. And I was thinking back, because Stephen mentioned Oedipus Rex and the problem. By the way, Oedipus Rex was not the first play. It was Antigone. And it was very interesting that Antigone, up until the Freudian period, so sort of mid-19th century, slightly before Freud, Antigone was the preeminent play by Sophocles. And I've been attending this seminar. It's a difficult one, and I'm not sure if I agree with it, but it was very interesting. And we got to a point where we were talking about, Antigone wanting to bury his brother. Okay. So it's family ties, relationship between families and, and people. And of course, Creon is forbidding that. Can't bury the father because he's a traitor, right, to the state. And she dig him up, she reburies him and so forth, okay? And we got to a point that, okay, so Creon is denying the first death. We will not let him die properly so he could go to Hades. That's bad. And then we got to a point where the play is written, and what happened is that in sort of doing that, there's a second burial, refusal of the burial. That's a creation of the state itself. The state, as the last cannibal, we will not allow this family relationship to take place. The state will overrule that, and we're not going to allow for even the second burial conceptually, because it's instituted in the state itself. So that's the state itself is doing violence. Civilization. We are become civilized, and we are not allowing the authentic relationship between people and family to do its thing. So therefore, in a sense, the state, by its constitution and structure, is overruling that. It is allowing it conceptually, not allowed that, let alone in actuality. So there's a second burial. And I asked the question in that discussion, I said, I wonder whether Sophocles, in writing a play, conceptually in the words, whether the words itself is allowing the third burial not to take place, because burying it in a concept is different from burying in actuality. So that's a very, very interesting thing about the relationship between life and death. I mean, not only are you not allowed to die in a funny way, in a proper way, but you're not allowed to die structurally, and you're not allowed to die. It's only an abstract relationship of burial in the concepts. So the words have a funny way of removing the reality from us in a funny way. It gives us a reality, but it also removes a certain amount, because it just sort of like conceptualize it. And it's sort of like, maybe if you interpret it the right way, it's floating in heaven. So the burial is already in heaven rather than Hades. I don't know. It just seems interesting that, and I think there was a great resistance at that time, before Socrates even, and even including Socrates, that words should not be structuralized. It should always be a verbal relationship, because it's a living language, rather than the fact that it is a dead language that is already buried within itself. So I think when Sophocles did his play, it was an enactment, not frozen in a text that is buried within words, which is also a misrepresentation of what it is in existence. So that's interesting that he started out with an incredibly radical play about criticizing not only the action, the mechanics of the state, and possibly a self-criticism, although he never wrote, well, I guess he did write it down. He wrote down the criticism of freezing the body rather than letting it, in a sense, decay in its own right way. So that's interesting. It's like, that's really radical. It's almost like negating, in a funny way, all of civilization. So that's a funny relationship. That is extremely radical. And I actually asked the question, if he wrote that first and it's such a radical interpretation, at least, of the play, how did he compromise in writing a kind of more friendly relationship of the wrongdoing of an individual to the state in Oedipus Rex? And then finally, in Oedipus the Colonus, a much more almost transcendental relationship to nature. That's interesting. From just an outright, a smackdown of the state itself, to say, yeah, Oedipus was wrong. It was a state that was actually being brutalized. So that's interesting. I just thought I would bring that up. So
Thank you.
I've always thought I mean, I love the play Antigone, but this radical interpretation is really, really kind of interesting of how revolutionary it was
Yeah.
against, in a sense, a formation of a state, at least a state that sort of like has these ironclad rules. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Well, between your observations on Antigone and Stevens on Oedipus Rex, I think it's time for me to reread the entire trilogy again. So I'm going to see it a new way this time. I'm just sure it's not going to read the same way it did last time. You know, that problem of the natural law, which Heraclitus calls the capital L logos, versus human law, nomos, right? And what are the relationship between the two? What's the relative authority? And to the ancients, the logos had more authority than the nomos. And Heraclitus thought aligning the nomos with the logos was a make or break, live or die existentialist crisis. You had to do it. If you didn't align human law with natural law, you were setting up your polis for a collision, a tragic collision with the way reality actually works. And you might not be able to see it yet, but that dissonance in the hidden harmony would eventually take you down. And there's elements of that throughout all three of the plays that Sophocles does in that trilogy, in which, where the discrepancy between the two becomes the wedge, in which tragedy enters. Geneva, and then we'll go back to the text. Geneva, what's on your mind?
Yeah, well, I love that you mentioned before that you'd never thought of the riddle the way in which Stephen presented it, because it's sounding to me like one of the things that is being criticized here are mistakes and missteps, which it wouldn't be a meeting if I didn't bring up Hayden, of course, which is part of that evolution of who we are. I mean, we have to make those mistakes. I mean, and as bad as Hitler was and all of these other things, we know better now. And so maybe I'm misunderstanding, but it kind of sounds like mistakes are a bad thing. And I don't think so. I think that's part of evolving and part of moving forward, finding a better way, finding the worst way, finding better. So I'm not sure if I'm misunderstanding, but I just thought I had to bring up Hegel, of course, and finding the seed, the tree, the leaf, we're going to get there eventually, but getting there involves taking wrong steps, moving in the wrong direction, tripping over our own feet. That's all part of it. So I just wanted to throw that in there because I'm always making these mistakes and tripping over my own feet and going the wrong direction and having to back up and go in the other direction. It's just a constant.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's the human condition, right?
Yeah. Well, my human condition, that's for sure. Yeah.
Well, mine too. I'm right there with you. Yeah, that's a telling point, and part of the way that the Greeks, the ancients in general, resolved it, although they got worse as the ancient epoch corrupted later on as it developed. But the way they tried to resolve it was by saying, you want to be learning and making mistakes before you hold power, right? You don't want to spend your childhood defensively covering up your mistakes and trying not to learn from them. You don't want to be in the grip of an ideology that prevents you from noticing and growing when you make mistakes. And you want to try a lot of things so you can make a lot of different mistakes and explore the territory and find out, where do your gifts lie, but also, where do your weaknesses lie? And what are you going to do about those? How are you going to develop as a whole human being? So where we get into trouble is when, instead of wanting that and then building later authority and power atop that solid foundation, we want the power now. We want what we want. The idiot term, idiota, that when the Greeks called someone an idiot, they didn't mean they were dumb. The smartest person in the world could be an idiot. All human beings are idiots. The problem we have is that we're preoccupied with our own things, with our own interests. We think the things we care about are the most important things. We think the things we know are the most important things. The religion that we're familiar with is the best religion. The language we speak is the best language. This is a natural tendency toward idiocy that's built within us. And it's a natural consequence of the structure of our mind. The fact that our conscious mind can only judge the things that the unconscious mind has served up to it as the 7 points of interest when it suppressed everything else into the background. Yeah, Stephen calls it mental incest. That's right. That's effectively the structure of the human mind. And so there needs to be a process of cosmopolitanism to broaden people, to help give people opportunities to break out of that claustrophobic envelope, of kind of circularity that's caused by being obsessed with one's own experiences in the case of naive gnosis, or obsessed with one's own ideologies and logics in the case of naive noesis, right? To how do you puncture those envelopes and give people peak experiences that can build into them the craving to transcend their current idiotic preoccupations? How do we teach people that the truth isn't in here, it's out there, and that we should be reaching out, and trying to explore what hasn't been explored before? How do you develop that taste in people? And how do you teach people to not crave power? Because the thing about power is, the more of it you have, the greater the consequences when you make a mistake. If you have very little power and you make a mistake, okay, I tripped and stubbed my toe, big deal. But if I'm a nuclear power, oh, I tripped and accidentally nuked a country. Oops. Oh well. The scale of the disaster grows as our power grows. This is kind of at the heart of the ancient perspective on tragedy, which is, it is our gifts that cause the tragedy. If we were mediocre, weak people, then the story of Oedipus would have had a mediocre ending of no particular import. It's because Oedipus was the strongest, the smartest, the bravest, the most honest. All of these virtues are what caused him to rise so high and tether all of Thebes to his fate, so that when things went wrong for him, the miasma descended upon the entire city-state. If he'd just been a peasant in the mountains where he ended up dumped as a child, there'd have been no tragedy, right? If you stub your toe, I guess it's like a teeny tragedy, but it's not much of a tragedy, right? But if you kill your dad and sleep with your mom and your children are also your siblings, this is a different scale, right? And you drag down the greatest city-state of that age with you. It's the power combined with the willful mistakes that sets up the disaster. So this is why Heraclitus says, he talks about epistemology relentlessly, like what you talked about, learning from mistakes, getting out and experiencing things. This is all in Heraclitus. He talks about this, but he also says it would not be better for people if they got what they wanted, because we want the wrong things. We want to skip over the learning part. We don't want to be publicly embarrassed by being wrong. We want to skip to the part where we're so powerful nobody's allowed to tell us we're wrong. We just want to jump ahead. Without maturing, we want to ape what we perceive to be the heroic stature of the people we admire. And by doing that, we throw ourselves unprepared into a situation that we can't possibly handle. And we swell the scale of the resulting tragedy. And one of the things that we said about a month ago, we were talking about the tragedy of Odysseus. And the tragedy of Odysseus is that he was so much smarter than Oedipus. Oedipus was the smartest dude in Thebes, and so he took down all of Thebes with him. But Odysseus was the smartest person in the Mediterranean world, so his tragedy took down the entire Bronze Age of the Mediterranean. Only somebody with his gifts could have had a tragedy on such a scale that it wiped out a civilization and caused a dark age, right? Oedipus could never have taken down the Bronze Age. He could only take down Thebes. So there is this be careful what you wish for thing, right? It's like You know, the society tells us that all the rewards come with power and stature, and therefore we should want power and stature. And the ancient perspective is, oh, no, no, no. You should run away from those things. Any power or stature that you get in life, you should take reluctantly, and only on the places where there's nobody else to do the job, where everybody else is worse. Then reluctantly you could do that little bit of power. And at all times, try to surround yourself with shock absorbers to catch your mistakes. You know, don't listen to your ego, which says, we're the best. Nobody's as good as we are. We should be unfettered and turned loose to do all the things that we want to do. Because as Nietzsche says, power makes stupid. Nobody says it more pithily than Nietzsche. The worst thing that can happen is to be given more power than you need, because it means all your mistakes become big mistakes and they hurt a lot of people instead of being small. So I guess that would be the ancient response, which is, yes, Geneva, we're right there with you. Life is all about learning. And ideally, it's also about titrating the amount of power and responsibility each of us has to the minimum that allows us to live a fully authentic, exploratory life at the stage of development that we're at. You know, in traditional Okinawan Kobudo, you know, there's only one edged weapon, but there's two. There's a short sword and shield. That's one of the weapon combos. And then, but the main one is, it's the sickles that they use for cutting sugarcane or harvesting papayas. Those things are razor sharp. We do not hand those to white belts. We do not. Or green belts, or brown belts, or first degree black belts. Nobody touches those things, because if I make a mistake with my tonfas, they're just wooden round cylinders, right? You know, ow, I bumped myself. Oh, well, tomorrow I'll be fine and I'll carry on, right? But if I bump myself with a razor sharp sickle, I just lost a finger, right? The mistake has permanent consequences. So we should titrate my access to power until by the time I pick up, you know, those commas, the sickles for the first time, I have already learned everything about how to control them from the other safer tools that don't have edges but use the same techniques. So I'm already massively prepared before I get there. That titration of power is one of the hardest things. It's one of the hardest things. You can see it as well in Aristotle, in the Athenian constitution and the politics, when he says the difference between the best forms of government and the worst forms of government has to do with the quality of the people who make up that government, not with the structure, but what is the character of the people doing it. He says, you know, good democracy is among the best forms of government there is. But what makes it good is that the people are prepared for it and that they share common goals and principles. Because if they don't share those goals and principles and they're not prepared to be mature adults, then having them vote for what to have for lunch is just 6 lions and a zebra voting for what to have to lunch. It's the worst of all forms of government. The exact same structure with different people in it. You know, it alternates between being the best and the worst. And so Aristotle's telling us this thing about the titration of power. You don't put power in the hands of people who are not ready for it. And none of us is ready for more power than we can handle. And so ideally, we should be seeking out the minimum amount to give ourselves the room to make the mistakes without causing disasters every time we do. I'm going to add one last thing about this. You know, the medical software that I work on, Vista, it's written in the M programming language, which is used a lot in medicine, pretty much nowhere else in the world. It has 2 different modes. And the mode that we give users is, you know, they press return and they get a sign-on screen. And when they sign in, they're in a menu system in which all their options are tailored for the job that they do. A lab tech sees a different set of options than a pharmacist, who sees a different set from a radiologist, who sees a different set from a doctor. A ward clerk sees an entirely different set. The ward clerk doesn't have access to the pharmacist's menu, right? Ward clerks can't be going around prescribing people drugs. And the top level of power is programmer mode. In programmer mode, it's like you pop the hood and you're in the machine shop and you have access to everything. You can change anything. There's no protection at all. For the same reason that when you take your car to the shop, you don't lock it and take the keys with you and say, good luck. I insist that you fix it, but I'm not going to give you access, right? That doesn't work. So So there is this condition that is normal to debugging and working on these medical systems where any mistake can have dire consequences. You've got your fingers on the live database and the live code. If you screw up, you could kill people. So in the early 90s, one of my favorite people in that community taught me a big lesson, which is that he was system manager for one of these hospitals. He had that level of access, but he had it turned off almost all the time. So in his normal operations, he denied himself access to programmer mode. He says only at the instant of debugging would he turn the access on for himself, fix the problem, and then turn it back off again. He said, because we're human and we're going to make mistakes. And when I make mistakes, I want them to be small mistakes. I don't want them to be, oops, I accidentally deleted the patient file mistakes. You know what I mean? It's like, so, I didn't until this very conversation connect the Heraclitean titration of, ignorance and power to that lesson from my work. But I see that it's the same thing. There's a certain wisdom in that. But it's only possible if you recognize that we are not infinitely smart, infinitely knowledgeable, the best and the brightest of all time. If you're willing to own your ignorance and your mistakes, then it becomes possible to do this kind of wisdom. You see that with this definition of idiot, idios, one's own, right? That to be wise, to begin to be wise, and Socrates makes this point as well, mainly starts with recognizing the danger of our natural tendency to blind ourselves to the bigger picture by over-focusing on what we're familiar with. That's all it takes to set up a tragedy. And it's built right into us, right? So Socrates says, if the oracle says that I'm the wisest of the Greeks, the only possible way that could be true is if it's because I make a bigger point of the fact that I don't know anything. That's the beginning of a safety net for the way this thing is structured. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, Geneva woke me up, got me out of my dogmatic slumber, like Kant reading Hume there. Geneva, we have learned a lot from Hitler. I don't think any of it is what you think. And I don't think it's what Kenneth thinks either. And I think Rick was pointing to it, to the answer, but I'll just give it to you straight. Modernity is still as noetic as it was when the mistakes of Hitler and Lenin were made. In fact, maybe more so. As Hannah Arendt pointed out, totalitarianism is the greatest contribution of the 20th century to political theory. It is the modern contribution to politics, is having the government should be all-inclusive, that the elimination of civil society would be a goal. And almost all of modern political parties have learned the technique lessons of Nazism and communism, the mechanisms of totalitarianism. And they use them they may say democracy or whatever, but the mechanisms for dealing with the populace are pretty much the ones that Hitler and Lenin pioneered. This was kind of really brought to me. Recently, I've been working on this book by Timothy Snyder called Bloodlands, about how Russia and Germany clashed in Eastern Europe for a long time. And he lays out their political thinking, not as Hitler was a monster and a madman, and Lenin and Stalin were crazy SOB, He says, no, these were extremely rational
people and goes through their arguments. Why did they need to kill both of them thought the Ukrainians had to starve to death. One, so their armies didn't have, Germany, or first, Russia, because you couldn't have Ukrainians eating the food that were going to feed the proletariat in the industrial plants of Russia. And the German armies, when they come there, didn't have the manpower to secure their rear. They needed empty land behind them. They were incredibly rational. And we still know it. And I think if you look, you still, I find like real irony in that we have political parties everywhere saying we need to save democracy. And the methods that they promote to save democracy are invariably censoring or exiling or imprisoning the opposition because they're anti-democratic. And if we don't stop the anti-democrats by using good modern totalitarian techniques, why, our democracy will go away. Well, yes, it's going away either way. I'm not going to say. And I liked your thing, Rick, about your developer mode. One of my early jobs when I was younger and sought more authority was I was the software manager for a computer center. I controlled all the software. And there were several people that worked there when I got that position that loved having the power to do everything. And I said, no, that's not what we want. What I want is when something goes wrong, I want to be able to prove that we couldn't have done it. That when a user screws up their own database, I want to prove that we were not in there. When they say their password got stolen, I want to show that we didn't set it, that we didn't access it. So I spent a lot of time denying all these accounts that had godlike privileges to deny them to us. We wrote utilities. So like if a user wants to change their password or needs to change their password, all we do is send an email and a utility that says, here's the utility, change your own password. We will never know it. So we can't have hacked you, and going all through the operations of the computer center, getting to a point where we could perform them or have them performed without leaving, not without leaving, without touching things that were not ours. And I had people work for me that just, that's why they wanted to be there, that they could look at everybody's file. They could see what everybody's doing. It's a nightmare. It is very wise. No power could prove we didn't do it. See, my hands are clean. No. Sorry, Geneva, that's not an attack on you. That's just, I think really where we are. We haven't. Noesis is not is not a facility of our mind that lets us learn from the failures of noesis. Or, you know, well, enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, no, that's this existentialist assessment of the structure of Homo sapiens' mind, that we have these two faculties, but each of them has the Achilles heel that from its own perspective it seems to be sufficient, and that you don't need anything else. So go ahead.
You know, I think of Kenneth Smith. I was having a dream the other night where, you know, he says all the time, you're either existentialist or you're deluded or escapist. And then I was dreaming this phrase, and then Sartre popped up. And I said, maybe it's not an either or.
Well. But yes, this idea that the natural faculties of the mind can't be trusted to be perfect, that there are architectural defects in our mind, and we can learn what they are and learn to work around them, but only if we admit that the problems are there. If we deny the problems are there and try to cover them up, then we fall prey to those defects. And thus we end up becoming a caricature of ourselves. We end up becoming an expression of the problem rather than an individual. So the way that gnosis, naive forms of gnosis, have their limitations, but naive gnosis is not in a position to offer that critique about itself. It's in a position to deny its weaknesses and seem to be sufficient. Live for the day. Live each day as though it's your last. Don't think too much. Just be immersed in reality. This is naive gnosis at work. And what naive gnosis can't tell you is why that doesn't give you a whole picture of reality, why that's not enough for a whole human life. But noesis has the same problem. So intellectuals try to escape out of naive gnosis by entering naive noesis. And then it's like, you know, the unexamined life is not worth living. Everything has to be analyzed and systematized and measured. Nothing that can't be measured isn't real, right? You're just building this clockwork structure of analysis of reality, and it has its own Achilles heels, but it itself denies that they exist, right? It too is a totalitarianizing mode of the mind, and it wants to erase the evidence that it doesn't work. And thus it's its own least competent critic. And so, you know, this expression of naive gnosis, this is Hegel's Begriff. And naive noesis, this is Hegel's Verstand. And as he says, both of these are infantilized modes of the mind, right? And yet naive noesis imagines it's the adult form because it has so much criticism, withering acidic criticism to give towards what it refuses to give a name of its own and insists on calling mere irrationality, right? That kind of hyper intellectualized rationality, it thinks it's an adult form, but it's just a second infantilized form. It also becomes a trap. And so Hegel says what we need, the only thing that counts as an adult human mind, is when we follow Heraclitus's guidance, where he says we need to harness the two onto each other in opposition to each other in a dynamic system like a bow or a lyre, where they each pull in the opposite direction from each other. Not a balance, right? Because that's fragile. It's easy to unbalance. And not a compromise, because that means you'd be watered down and neither of your faculties works well. But a palintropy, a dynamic system, where when you pull on one, the other one tugs back. So you can pull as much as you want to, right? You can use each faculty to its greatest extent, but at all times, the other faculty is also present, critiquing it, watching its weaknesses. Because although noesis can't critique itself, gnosis can critique noesis. And although gnosis can't critique itself, noesis can critique gnosis. So when they're harnessed together, They can act as correctives to each other, critics of each other, watching each other, assessing each other. And that's the only way out of the two traps that are offered to us at a naive level, at what Hegel and Kenneth Smith called the basal metabolic functions of the mind, naive gnosis and naive noesis. Because there is this third form, which involves harnessing them in opposition to each other in order to create a dynamic system. But it doesn't come naturally, it doesn't come easily. It is our teleology. We are supposed to develop into that. That is the adult mind, but it's a struggle at repeated points. We have to struggle to overcome each of these traps on our way to the third form. And it's just so easy. Each of these two basal modes, it's so easy to just believe it when it tells you there's no need to struggle. There's nothing good over there. Just stay here. I've got all your answers. I can explain everything. You'll feel comfortable here for the rest of your life. No need to live in that uncomfortable state of self-negation that's required to achieve the adult mind. And in the modern world, as Kenneth Smith argues, hyper extended noesis basically defines everything for us. And among the things that it defines is it says there is no third state of the mind. Noesis is the highest possible mind because it's rationality. And the only alternative is irrationality. And who'd want to be irrational? That's the source of all evil things, chaos and badness and, feelings. We can't have those. Those are terrifying. We wouldn't want people to have different perspectives. That's terrifying. So we will have one machine-like logic that will always tell us what to think and what to do. And that will count as adulthood. And the result of this is that we abort the final birth into the adult mind. No one is allowed to become an Aristos. No one is allowed to develop Vernunft. It is classified as being identical to Begriff, right? That the presence of the irrationality makes it be folded into the naive form of irrationality, and therefore we say it's the same as, and therefore it's not desirable. So you can't harness them together. It would be wrong to harness them together morally. Hannah Arendt's critique in The Origins of Totalitarianism, which Donald was talking about, she says the easy critique of communist Russia and fascist Germany is that they were irrational and that we defeated them because we're better than they are because we're rational. Rationality always wins. Rationality is the proper destiny of mankind. We must all become Vulcans. This is modernity's argument. And that's why when confronted with Nazism and Stalinism, the only way we could possibly interpret them is they must be irrational, right? Those Nazis must be hateful. They're so full of hate. It's the feeling, right? It contaminated their thinking. They had a feeling, and if only they could have excised, they could cut that feeling out of themselves, they could have been as good as we are. But no, poor them. They were infantilized and primitive and full of feelings. This is what we say. We say Hitler was a madman. The Nazis were hateful. Hannah Arendt says there's no actual evidence that's true. The evidence is to the contrary. They had a logic. They made a logical program for Germany. They made logical arguments about purity and contamination. And if you buy the premise, the whole rest of the Holocaust follows logically, inexorably from that premise. The problem isn't in the logic, it's in the premise. And if there's one thing that logic can't criticize, it's its own premises. That's where it's one of the two Achilles heels. Logic has two of them. Where did your premises come from? And why did you decide to stop at this point in your logic and call the result a conclusion? But the both ends are where the problem is in that schema. So Hannah Arendt says, far from having inadequate rationality, the Nazis had too much rationality. They said, well, I know it's distasteful and uncomfortable to be exterminating people, but what can we do? You don't want to be illogical, and the logic says we have to do it. It's the final solution because it's where the steps of logic lead you. We tried the other steps along the way. They were all refuted. Ergo, this must be the conclusion. And if you question it, that means you're questioning logic, and that means you're irrational, and that means you don't get to hold power and you don't get to make decisions. Only people willing to obey the logic get to hold power. Stalinism is the same way. It's just a different set of premises. but it has an equally obsessive attachment to rigorously, logically determining the behavior from those premises. And yes, it's uncomfortable. Millions of people being shunted off to the gulags, purges left and right, and yes, widespread pollution of the Russian countryside in order to rapidly industrialize, permanent damage to our ecosystem. Well, that's unfortunate. But who are you to question the logic? If you question the logic, you're irrational, and that means off to the gulags you go. So again, there is this question of if we are so enamored of logic, and yet logic has this flaw that it can lead us to do horrific things. Because, you have to obey the logic. You're not allowed to intervene on the basis of mere feelings just because you feel icky murdering lots of people. How is that allowed to be a part of the equation? It's not. Those are just feelings. You have to follow the equation, do what it says. So we're being offered two classic examples of the end game of modernity. And there's more throughout the 20th century. There's plenty of more to pick from. It is the most common aberration politically in the 20th century, is people taking the logic where it goes, and next thing you know, Pol Pot's exterminating everybody with an education, right? Because it's those damn intellectuals who are the problem. It's the salt of the earth. Those are the good people. So, we're just going to murder everybody who's got a degree. If you buy the logic and you don't allow feelings to get in the way, you have to do what the logic says. All of these crazy, to us, extreme consequences are what happens when you are a pure modern. To be purely modern is to be purely rational, is to not let, morality or feelings or, where this is all going get in the way of doing the logical thing. So this is what Donald means when he says totalitarianism is the modernity's contribution to political theory. You won't find it in Aristotle's listing of the various forms of government. The ancients didn't have that much power. Totalitarianism wasn't a choice for them. The medieval period longed for totalitarianism and genocide, right? That was all about, let's exterminate all the other religions because we've got the right one. If God can be in charge of everything and we'll tell you what God wants, then we can make a paradise on earth. And that means anybody who questions us is questioning God. And that means they need to go to hell. There is this really simple structure that lent itself to extermination. But the problem was the medievals didn't have the technology for it. If they wanted to get rid of all of the alternatives, they just couldn't pull it off. So they couldn't contribute to totalitarianism. They could only contribute to totalitarianism as a desire, not as an actual program. But hey, we've got an industrial revolution. So now we can finally do that thing that medieval Europe wanted to do. And we keep finding ourselves doing it over and over. And every time we do it, like Oedipus in Oedipus Tyrannus, we have to make excuses for why that happened and scapegoat somebody other than ourselves. Because the one unthinkable thought is that the thing that we want more than anything leads to these terrible outcomes. We can't allow that to be true. Our ideology is that the thing we want more than anything leads to a practical utopia. The best possible outcome is to be rational. We're sure of that part. So every time we find evidence that contradicts it, we just suppress it and reinterpret it, which it turns out Homo sapiens is hardwired to be very, very good at doing. We can reinterpret any situation as anything we need it to be. And that's our problem as a species. So I'm mostly just trying to agree with Donald, but reframe it a little bit to say kind of this is the take. And I think Kenneth Smith would agree with Donald about this. This is, he's a real critic of this stuff. And this is all foretold by Nietzsche. Before I call on the hands, one thing that I learned in this last 2 weeks that I didn't know before, you guys probably know Nietzsche was depressed about the rise of German nationalism and anti-Semitism. He hated anti-Semitism. He hated German militarism. He wrote withering critiques of them. And then when his sister got control of his writings after he was put in the asylum, she edited them in order to make them seem like he was pro-anti-Semitism and pro-German nationalism and pro-militarism, because her boyfriend was an anti-Semite and a German nationalist. So she reworked Nietzsche's material to make it say the opposite of what he'd stood for his entire life. And that's the Nietzsche that the Nazis embraced. the fake Frankenstein recut. But the actual authentic Nietzsche foresaw something terrible coming out of Germany. He saw the decline of kind of what he saw as an older, wiser culture and the rise of this terrible, vicious thing. We knew about that. We've talked about that in this course before. What we haven't talked about is Brahms' Fourth Symphony. And I'm not going to spend any time on it today other than to say I have learned that the Fourth Symphony, which sounds like an elegy, which most essays about it say, well, it's because he was getting old and he was feeling like maybe he would die soon. And so he wrote this elegiac thing because he was in an elegiac mood. But if you keep Googling Brahms Fourth and anti-Semitism, you will find some deeper historical essays that have gone further and into his writings and his letters and found that just like Nietzsche, Brahms was looking around Germany going, uh-oh, I don't like what I'm seeing. I'm seeing the rise of anti-Semitism. I'm seeing the rise of nationalism. I'm seeing the rise of militarism. I'm afraid that the old Viennese culture, of music and art and dance, I think it's passing away and something terrible is being born. So Brahms' Fourth Symphony is actually his homage to the end of a great era and the rise of something terrible. Wilhelm Furtwängler, a famous conductor of the 20th century, who the Nazis tried to hold up as a big icon to prove that the Nazis have culture, hated the Nazis and hated anti-Semitism and refused to play if there were Nazi regalia in the hall. He spent all of his proceeds helping Jews escape from Nazi Germany. And whenever he was on tour, he would rehire all the Jewish musicians the Germans had kicked out, and they would be his musicians from the tour. He wouldn't bring back any of the money to give to the German government. He gave it all to the Jews who were playing in his orchestras. There is possibly the greatest performance of Brahms' Fourth Symphony ever was conducted by Furtwängler in Berlin during the height of the Nazi power. And here he is playing this piece that was the ultimate criticism of the rise of everything that the Nazis stood for. And Furtwängler's just shamelessly basically giving a middle finger to the Nazis. You can, if you search YouTube for a Brahms Fourth and Furtwängler in 1943, you'll find that performance. It's electric. It's volcanic. And ultimately, this existentialist critique says that's not just about the Nazis. Following up on what Donald said, that's about modernity and its horrible endgame. Stephen, then Phil, then Joseph. Go ahead, Stephen. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Let's bringing up the question of rationalism. I get in the minor fights with the local rationalists, and as far as they're concerned, they've got an attitude of religious devotion towards rationalism. And one day, I was talking about things, and our local rationalist says, "Oh, Stephen, I thought you were always against rationalism." And I said, no, I'm not against rationalism. And he goes, I'm glad that you've finally seen the light. And this is religion. And for years, I did learn one thing in my little studies. As I point out, I've become aware of the fact that I'm not the greatest mind in human history. It took me a while. But I did learn something. I was trying to look for the definition of rationalism, and the word means to measure. And what it means is you're measuring what you're experiencing on the basis of what you have learned. It's like literally the way we measure things. We take the foot, and then we measure everything in feet as a unit of length. And with rationalism, we take a unit of ideas and measure experience on that. And the problem with the rationalists is that they think their body of ideas are the universal truth. No, it's just that what you little human beings know, which within a narrow a narrow sphere of existence, much of the time works well, but it's not perfect. This is the trouble with the rationalists. They keep on thinking that they have a perfect set of ideas. This used to be believed about mathematics. That in mathematics, we must know perfection. And of course, you know, people like Gödel said, well, not so fast. But people, these rationalists don't realize if we make everybody conform to our perfect ideas, it will be a perfect world. It's what they fail to notice, that their primary measurements, their primary ideas are not perfection. And if you go measuring the world on the basis of what you know, you can make enormous errors. The process is beautiful. It's perfect. It's the machine that can't fail. It's a bit like the story of the Andromeda strain, if you've ever seen the movie. The whole point is their whole assembly almost made things worse. The space disease was going to die on Earth anyway, because ultimately the environment was hostile. But wildfire had, you know, nuclear devices in case the disease ever escapes. We blow the place up, but they've discovered that the microbe feeds on nuclear energy. It would have spread over the entire Earth. If they had have done nothing, they would have been better off. Fortunately, they're able to disarm the nuclear device. So that's the irony of the story. And it's like, you know, when you're a kid and you're using ideas, we must have all had the experience many times of having an inadequate understanding of what's going on and thinking we can use our inadequate understanding as a basis to judge what's going on around us. That's how you make a fool of yourself. That is what an idiot is. We've all had that experience, I'm certain of it, many times when we were young. Well, that's the problem. You are limited. Your measurements of reality are limited by what you know. And what you know is not universal. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, it feels heretical to criticize reason. And of course, the result of that is that it's very hard to have a balanced discussion with someone about the idea that reason might not be the same as omniscience, that it might not be possible for human beings to understand the full range of things we could understand if we only use one of our two core faculties, that the other faculty might also be necessary, that it might be complementary, and the two might, it might be that evolution didn't screw up when it arranged for us to develop two different faculties, not just one. Right? I mean, this is kind of, it's hard to have a nuanced discussion about this. So if you end up saying, you know, look, a hammer is a fine tool, but it's not the only tool in the toolkit. There's other tools. And for certain problems, you maybe should put the hammer down and pick up the other tool. You know, you get a strong negative reaction if you say rationality isn't always right, because we have defined rationality to mean all the good things of the mind. And ergo, anything that's not rational is all the bad things of the mind. You know, we have these apocalyptic heaven and hell categories that we've sorted the brain into instead of dealing with how things actually are. It's crazy. Thanks, Stephen. Phil, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to compliment you for mentioning Furtwängler and Brahms. I always thought Furtwängler, you know, like I had a mixed feeling because he was labeled as a Nazi, but I didn't know about this particular story that he was actually an internal struggle. I love Brahms' Fourth Symphony, by the way. It's one of my favorite. But also very important was Furtwängler. I really love Furtwängler's interpretation of Schumann's Fourth Symphony. It's really excellent. It's probably the best one. It's the recording is modern enough that it retains some of the sounds that you want to hear. So I would say that, and Brahms and Schumann had a very, very good relationship. So let me just say it that way. But I want to get to what I want to say. You know, this thing about what I would call the tensional relationship. I want to credit Hans Hofmann for teaching me that, is the push-pull of the tensional relationship. The problem is that too many people, whether you're an existentialist or a rationalist, are both sides of a one-dimensional man. And you know, you have to have the two dimensions, but not only the two dimensions themselves in isolation, but a three-dimension that puts it together in this dynamic push-pull. It's interesting. I wonder how is it that I had intuition of creating my triangle relationship between art, philosophy, and the human spirit. I think the human spirit is the thing that try to balance the relation of this push-pull together. You know, quite often I use the metaphor of you know, being at the city gates, you know, or whether this push-pull. I kind of think that art, it's important because art has this sort of more intuitive aspect to the archai, and philosophy has a more kind of a reason relationship. And I find that tandem relationship is kind of important because it provides the push-pull, yeah, and that human spirit could live in that struggle. And I was thinking, as I was thinking back, it really reminded me of Narcissus. Narcissus looks into the water and sees the representation, or the what I call it, the reflection. And that's a kind of an important word, because the inflection has this kind of like image, although as a representation of the real, it's an image of the real. So that's a direct reflection. But reflection also means deep thinking, contemplation. And I think that's an interesting relationship because Narcissus sort of didn't get it right because he just was too attracted to the appearance of the reflection. Oh, it's just so wonderful, so beautiful. But you also need the other aspect, which is the contemplation, the deep thinking that could, in a sense, create that push-pull between the interior and the exterior. I think that relationship is a very, very important thing because that's what the human spirit needs. And it seems to me, one of the things I like about Heidegger, of course, Heidegger was also a Nazi, so there's a problem there, is that Heidegger goes back to the Greeks. And the one thing that he has that I like very much is that human beings have the ability to reveal being. You know, so you have something like Parmenides, being is, but it never really reveals it. What the hell is that? You know, it's like, okay, you gotta wrap it up in this sentence, you know, is that's it. You know, that's the way things are. That's the way it is. So I think that that's an important thing for us to remember. We're in such a privileged position if we took advantage of that even though we're not God, let's say, well, let's not say God, let's say we don't totally understand the infinite, you know, we have the ability to reveal things as they come. And I think Narcissus is not totally wrong. He just didn't have the other dimension, because what the impression is, what the image is that it gives you insight. that you could then contemplate and produce a more of a relationship between interiority and the exterior. I think that insight, I was glad that I got that, because I used to think it was intuition, but it's a really insight. You say, yeah, yeah, I see, I see the leaves are changing, think something's happening, that's an insight. And without that insight, it's like you're trapped in to the a priori structure. and, and you never have this relationship with the exterior, even though you don't know what the hell the leaf really is, but you do see that it is representing itself and something is happening, and that allows you to see into the insight, which is, which gets back to Artemis in a way. You're looking at the world, and that insight brings it into the interior. So there is a relationship between the mind, and the world through vision, And as I mentioned a couple of times before, the great Southern California artist, what's his name now? I forgot his name, but he said, it's not the fact that if the tree fell in the forest and there's nobody there here, is there sound? He said something more profound. If the tree fell in the forest, no, is there man if trees never fell in the forest? It's that insight of the experience that helps to develop us for who we are, that we could catch the insight in the net of understanding, in the net of the perception. So I think I was going to say something about, what's the name now? Geneva said about mistakes are important. I acknowledge that, but you got to understand that in a way, there's a duality in that push-pull. The relationship of mistakes is that there is insight and creativity and the ability to see what repetition is. Is this a good repetition or is this a bad repetition? And if you don't have that duality of being able to distinguish it, which is through, in a sense, reflection, this is deep thinking, then in a sense, the repetition is affirmation. But sometimes repetition is not an affirmation, it's something you should avoid. So I think that's important to understand that, yeah, don't keep making the mistake. Or if it's a good thing, do more of it. I remember learning this when I was painting. When I was still in college quite a bit, I found that quite often when I make mistake, things got better because I got insight from it. It got to a point where I actually said, I'm just gonna make mistakes, and something will happen. And I realized after a while, yeah, something happened, but that was a false preposition in a way, I'll make mistakes so I can force myself to be creative. But the creativity comes out of the mistake rather than the fact that it's a natural mistake that happened and you see it and you evolve from it. So I stopped doing that after a while. I decided I'll just let it happen as it was, and I catch it. Sometimes I don't catch it, but sometimes I do, and I catch it and I say, oh, I could do something with that. And I think that's a natural development rather than, yeah, just go ahead and make a lot of mistakes. Something will happen. No, other things will also happen. That's it. I just want to connect the inside and the outside and the push-pull and the relationship between the two. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Joseph, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So, don't kick me out of the group for saying this. I think that there is an underlying issue that we have to do just consider, because I think in some ways we can sound like the rational, we're demonizing the rational mind, and we're not. And so it's not as if the rational mind is something, to be basically distanced from ourselves from. It's our way of understanding. Now, it's when we believe that we have all the answers and become dogmatic and think that the rational mind is the only thing that matters. And I think that kind of relates back to some of the things that we were talking about a little bit earlier, in the sense that how we become our own worst enemies. We begin to think we have all the answers. We stop asking questions. And in a way, I think it's, again, it's a way to, it's against our own human nature to stop asking questions. And I mean, this is what Aristotle, with his natural curiosity as part of being, almost a virtue. It is a virtue in and of itself that you continue to ask questions. And it's, I think that one of the biggest issues that we tend to face is when we become successful and without making mistakes. And there is a lack of humility in that. And with that, you think you have all the answers, and then it becomes a tragedy. So I think the important thing to recognize here is that that dogma, thinking we have the answers to all the questions, is the real enemy. Is that when we stop, searching for answers and think we have them. So the idea that, we're I don't know anything and know thyself, that we stop doing that if it's the opposite, is to say I know everything. I have all the answers. But I just think it's important to kind of understand that the balance here, and what the ultimate thing that is problematic, I think, and leads to a tragedy, is dogma. Because there could be dogma in stories as well, where we take those stories to be true, and that becomes dogma. We have all the answers that way too. Yeah, and anyway, there's also just you've also given me a new perspective on how Aristotle's poetics as well, with the formalization of tragedies, and how he actually, was thinking about that. I appreciated that, with everybody's contributions. But anyway, that was one thing. It's just when anything drowns out our natural curiosity, we tend to make more mistakes, and that's really kind of the enemy more than anything else. Not the rational mind per se, in and of itself. It's the negation of that. So
thank you for that clarification, Joseph. That's right on the money. And that's the nuance that's so hard to establish normally when you start critiquing a culture that's excessively rational. It's very hard to do it without it sounding like you're saying reason is bad. But of course, that's not what we mean at all. It's like just if I overuse my right arm and I underuse my left arm, and my left arm starts to atrophy, the problem isn't that I should chop off my right arm. And I'm not advocating chopping it off. It's that I've got more than one to work with here, and I need them both. And of course, in the case of kenosis and noesis, they're more different from each other than one arm from the other. They really aren't substitutes for each other. Each one can do things the other one simply can't do. So yeah, we have, we kind of, I'm glad you brought it up, because we do have to keep underlining that in these discussions, or else what we're trying to say ends up coming across as a caricature when it's actually something complex.
Well, I did say reflection was deep thinking as well,
Yeah.
So Russ, Ross, how do you how do you feel that we've managed to avoid the text altogether once again?
I'm about to take us to the text. Behold the text I pasted at the beginning. We have 12 minutes to make some progress. But see, all of this was helpful, right, for setting up the premise. So with all that in mind, a couple of things about this. So with the first sentence, notice he starts by saying like the slow wheeling of the constellations. We're inclined to read that the same way we read Aristotle saying by nature. We think that's just flavor text. But what he means is that the modulation from mythos culture to logos culture was so slow that just like you can't notice the constellations are moving unless you measure them meticulously year after year after year for decades, the Greeks didn't notice the change. It was impossible to notice that they themselves were changing until one day they looked back and said, wow, the stuff we used to write is weird. It's like there was this shock of the unfamiliar that eventually occurred that they eventually had to explain. You see it kind of being dramatized almost in the form of a tragedy in Thucydides' The Peloponnesian War, when he is having the Athenians make these incredible speeches, incredibly noble speeches about what their intentions are and how they stand for what's good and what's right. And, they want to be that mythic vernunft culture, right? That combines the two. Pericles bragging about how Athenians, unlike Spartans, don't spend their entire childhood learning only how to fight and nothing else. That they can have a life with art and dance and music and religion and still be good warriors. That you can be a whole human being by working the whole, both faculties of your brain and developing them. And yet then they turn around and, murder city-states for not handing over the money that actually they shouldn't be paying anymore because the Persian War has been long gone. It's that there is Thucydides. It's hard for a modern to read it the way Thucydides means it, but Thucydides is showing you how they believe and say one thing, but then they do the opposite, and they themselves don't notice particularly that they're doing it. There are moments, like one of the speeches, where they have to admit, yeah, okay, maybe we're not entirely living up to everything we believe in, but we're going to kill you all anyway. We have, now that the war is here, we feel like we don't have a choice, so too bad for you. But that's less striking than the moments when it's obvious that the experience of being Athenian has diverged from the ideology of what Athenians think it means to be an Athenian. Thucydides is, in one of the best, richest possible ways from Greek literature, he's illustrating the diremption that happens when people become overly noeticized to the point that they can look at themselves behaving in an overly noeticized fashion and fail to recognize that that's what's occurring. But to anybody else looking at it, it's just obvious. They've gone wrong. They're off the rails. It could have been a lesson for us to head off a lot of the tragedies of the 20th century if we could have read it the way Thucydides meant it. So slow wheeling. This isn't like Oedipus Tyrannus. This isn't like the sudden stark moment when the scales drop off and you realize what happened. This is like you don't even notice until one day, your ancestors' writings just seem weird and foreign to you. That's how logos culture crept upon the Greeks and drew them out of mythos culture, not all at once. And yet, as he says, among the Greeks, philosophy indeed did not become an arid figment of the intellect, but retained the voice of a distinctive individual. That is to say, Greek philosophy was nothing like modern philosophy. Modern philosophy has a tendency to get exactly as arid as he's applying. That's his little criticism, is his side swipe of modern so-called philosophy, which he accuses of being intellectual and escapist. And escapist, right? Obsessed with weird little things that don't actually cause you to question the basic power structures of your society. But he's saying, among the Greeks, even after they shifted towards a logos culture, almost every other word out of their mouth was still something that was mythically laden. They're still talking about Zeus. They're still talking about Athena. They're still talking, they're using, even if they drop the name, they're still talking about wisdom. They're still talking about authority. They're using the secondary language of their religion to express their philosophy. And those metaphors, like for that complex, this isn't going to help Jennifer, and we'll have to talk about it another week if she comes back. But that complex, nuanced take on the relationship of free will and determinism that's bound up in Heraclitus's, ethos anthropoi daimon. It's using daimons, right? Gods. It's using minor gods as a metaphor for the kind of authority that a person's character has over their own behavior, and the level to which we are subject to it, and therefore how important it is to study lifelong what the hell is my character, so that I can figure out why I do the things that I do with or without my voluntary permission. So this is what he means when he talks about it keeps the voice of a distinctive individual. This, you would never mistake the writings of Aristotle or Heraclitus or Diogenes, or any of these other writers. You wouldn't mistake them for philosophers from anywhere else on earth. They're just soaking in their culture, and they bring it with them. And unlike Kant, they're not ashamed of this irrational residue, but on the contrary, they're using it to construct their rational systems. And it wouldn't work without them. They're not trying to pretend that there's not an irrational component to their philosophy. So even as they move into logos culture, there's still a very strong element of mythos culture. And it's why Diogenes can go through the marketplace with his lantern on and say that he's looking for a single honest person and he hasn't found one yet. And all the people around, rather than beating him up for daring to insult him, they're all like, ooh, good one. They're like, they get the mythic resonance of what he's doing and they appreciate it for its own sake, right? You don't see any hyper intellectualized philosophers criticizing Diogenes for doing that, for saying, how dare you do an irrational thing? What are you, some kind of primitive? Don't you have real philosophy? They all go, ooh, cool. I wish I'd thought of that. They get the importance of it. And that's one of the ways in which ancient Greek logos culture is still worlds apart from modernist hypernoetic philosophy. It's when we call it logos culture, we don't mean that it's like moderns. But you can see why moderns would appreciate that period among the Greeks, because that's where we get the faintest of reflections of ourselves. And like Narcissus, we go, ooh, I like what I see. You guys must be our forebears. We will allow you to participate in our great march of progress. You can be one of our cornerstones because you look like us. All right, so then he says, this revolution in which critical reason apparently deposed more flamboyant, elusive myths, displacing one kind of story, mythos, by another, logos, would never have been possible without the subliminal and intuitive preordination of Greek intelligence by myth. And this is a sentence that doesn't make any sense if you use the modern definition of myth, but it makes perfect sense if you use the ancient definition of myth. That is to say, the whole reason mythos existed as an art form was to help format the mind to appreciate the hidden harmonies of life, to notice the things that otherwise we would overlook. Kitty. To leave a spot in our conscious mind reserved for noticing what's happening underneath. That prepared people to create philosophy in a way that if they'd begun in a completely logos culture and never had a mythos background, they would not have been able to pull that off. Mythos is all about the excess burden, the excess freight of every interaction with reality, that there's so much that we can measure and systematize, and then there's a bounty beyond that that isn't going to lend itself to those techniques. And that extra bounty does not become unimportant just because it doesn't lend itself to being hammered like a nail. It too matters, and it too has to be taken into account. That prepared the Greeks to create even their logos-based philosophies, to structure them about topics that really matter, like free will versus determinism, in an intelligent way. So this is what he's saying here. This is what he's talking about. let's see if we can do the rest of this paragraph I'll at least get it up there and we can talk about it. But once a more stringent sense of logic and rationality consolidated itself, the Greek philosophers found themselves looking back across a chasm of unthinkable transitions to the ways of archaic imaginations. And Stephen Broussard, who has a whole series on the history of philosophy, he separates, for example, the Hellenic period from the Hellenistic period, the Alexandrian period. And he says by the time you get into the Alexandrian period, they've gone so far down the academicizing, intellectualizing, cataloging route that they can make libraries, but they can't come up with philosophies that are as potent as what the archaic philosophers were able to come up with. And part of the reason that they can't do that is that now the myths don't seem compelling to them. Right now they're writing, how dare Apollo rape Daphne? Right? They see in the myth a dude raping a woman. And what they don't see is the underlying myth that was attempting to be told of enlightenment overtaking someone who's unwilling, right? When Aeschylus says, drop by drop, wisdom is distilled from pain, and it comes upon us against our will. He's saying the same thing that the myth of Apollo chasing Daphne was trying to say. But the earlier archaic audience could understand it the way Aeschylus did. Whereas the later overly logical, rational Hellenistic audience couldn't see the idea that these are metaphors for the invisible and the divine. All they could see was a dude chases a woman and rapes her, and that's immoral, and therefore Apollo sucks. Let's all become Christians, right? That was actually used as an argument towards conversion to Christianity in the later period, was, your gods are immoral because they were just people and they did things that if people did them would be awful things. They were supposed to be that weird in the archaic because they're not supposed to be people. They're supposed to be the great forces of the cosmos that we're subject to, whether we like it or not. And that metaphor doesn't play well in an age in which we're critiquing rape, throughout our culture, and misogyny and things like that. We're not the audience for which it was written. If somebody were going to create a mythos for us, it would have to use very different metaphors that could speak to us, that we could hear, assuming that there were still such metaphors that a people like us could speak. So I'm just going to go a little further. We'll wrap up in a minute or two. How could such crudely fantastic things ever have seemed credible? This is what the Hellenistic and Roman and later Christian people are asking themselves about these crazy Greek myths. How could their predecessors have been so naive? As moderns look on the mind ways of primitives, what we call primitives, so the Greeks of the ancient Enlightenment looked back on their credulous forebears, for which they assumed they were credulous. So what was actually happening was something more interesting than that. For myths are not arguments. They're not logical arguments. And do not say explicitly or literally what they're about, but only allude in a murky way, right? They're trying to touch the intangible, to get your hands around the invisible and pull it up to a place where you can see it. And that creates a murkiness of thought that noesis is not comfortable with. Noesis starts to sense it's in the presence of the things it doesn't like. And it wants to shove all that stuff under the rubric irrational and dispense with it, and make those uncomfortable questions go away. Viewed from an intellectualizing standpoint, myths seem a way of trafficking in pseudo-knowledge, right? Thunder doesn't come from Thor. This is false. It's pseudo-knowledge. An obscurantism that is like a taste for making things messy and complicated, which is often what philosophers are accused of in the modern world. So you just think too much. You don't know how to say things directly and plainly. This is the criticism that's always given to philosophers. And when we say that, we don't understand that we're echoing what the Romans said about their own philosophers. The Romans were hostile to philosophy, and philosophers had to apologize and try to prove that they had some practical application, for fear that they would get in trouble with their Roman peers. And this is how we are, only to an even greater extent. We accuse people of being obscurantist on purpose. You're just trying to make things hard. An obscurantism, the formative purpose and a cultural effect of which is unthinkable to the more sophisticated mind, to the logos mind, to the later mind. It's like there can't possibly be anything interesting going on under these myths from a hyper-rationalist perspective. It must only be some form of superstition and ignorance. And thus, the noesis encloses itself by cutting itself off from the possibility that it's missing something important, right? It has redefined the thing it didn't understand as being an unthing or an anti-thing. And thus, gnosis and noesis end up turning into irrationality and rationality. And rationality thus convinces itself it's not missing anything worth missing. It's only missing bad things. This is how the diremption in the brain happens as a system changes from a mythos culture to a logos culture. This is what he's talking about here. All right, that's been our 3 hours. We'll pick this up again next week. We're moving on to the next paragraph. Wow, we are really flying by comparison with some previous weeks. But this is what I promised, right? I said we got through the hard part about mythos and logos and suke. And with that intact, now it's possible to read this the way that Kenneth Smith actually means it. Hope you all had a lovely time. Have a great week. Hope I see you.
Okay, thanks a lot.